Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're settling in with a story about the strangest trick that money can play on a family, the trick of vanishing. We're going to spend the next few hours with the Vanderbilts, a name that once meant more wealth than the entire United States government held in its own treasury. A family that built stone palaces just to spend 8 weeks a year in them, and then, across only a handful of generations, watched that same unimaginable fortune slip through their fingers until there was almost nothing left to hold. This is a story of steam and iron, of glittering ballrooms and marriages arranged like business contracts, of a pile of money so enormous that no one alive could imagine an end to it, right up until the night the music stopped. Before we get comfortable, I want to say a genuine thank you to the members of this community who suggested we spend an evening with this particular family. Stories like this one only happen because you write in, because you leave a note in the comments, because you nudge me toward corners of history I might never have wandered into on my own. If tonight's journey is good company for you, a like and a subscribe always helps this channel keep going, only if you're genuinely enjoying it, of course. And do drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. It always seems to be somewhere around midnight for someone. If closing your eyes and drifting off is more your evening than watching a screen, this channel is also available on Spotify now, with the link waiting for you below. And if tonight simply isn't long enough for you, there's a full ad-free extended edition available to channel members. One uninterrupted stretch of calm for the nights when a single story just won't cut it. Now let the lights come down low. Let a fan hum somewhere in the background if that's your kind of quiet. Pull the blanket up around your shoulders and let your body go heavy and still. Before we begin, let me ask you something. What would it feel like to be born holding more money than entire countries? To go your whole life never once glancing at a price tag? Could you spend a fortune so large that spending it became its own occupation, its own career? Would some part of you notice that the marble floors were cold, that the ballrooms were beautiful but hollow? Or would you simply keep dancing and let the question go unanswered? And how, exactly, does a family fall from the richest name in the country to a reunion hall full of relatives who, between all of them, cannot scrape together a single millionaire? Tonight we're going to trace that long, slow fall from the very top all the way down to the bottom, gently, one generation at a time. So let the year settle in around you. It's the early 1800s, and on a windy strip of Staten Island, a barefoot boy who can't stand being cooped up indoors is about to build the largest personal fortune his country has ever seen. He has no idea yet what's coming. Neither do we. Let's begin. Long before there were mansions, before there were railroads, before the Vanderbilt name carried any particular weight at all, there was simply a restless boy who could not bear 4 walls and a roof. Cornelius Vanderbilt came into the world in 1794, born to a family of unremarkable Dutch farmers on Staten Island, plain, hardworking people who expected their children to grow up plain and hardworking too. Cornelius had other plans entirely. He couldn't stand the schoolroom. Reading never quite clicked for him. What he wanted, every hour he could steal for it, was to be down at the water, watching the boats cut across the harbor. His teachers saw a stubborn, hopeless student. The sea saw something else, a boy already, without knowing it, plotting how to own it. The Vanderbilt name had crossed the ocean generations earlier with Dutch settlers who took to farming the low green land where the harbor met open water. By the time Cornelius was born, the family was doing fine, comfortable, unremarkable, nothing close to grand. They raised vegetables, kept animals, and every so often ferried a load of produce across to the markets of Manhattan. It was decent, unglamorous, never-ending work, and young Cornelius approached it with all the enthusiasm most children reserve for chores they despise. School simply never took. The letters on the page seemed to swim and rearrange themselves the moment he tried to read them. Spelling made no sense to him at all, and a teacher's droning voice felt to him like a slow form of punishment. For the rest of his life he would remain only barely able to read, signing his name in a rough, labored scrawl, dictating letters rather than writing them himself. Picture him as the kid in the back row, eyes fixed on the window, counting the minutes until the bell rings. Now put a rope and a sail in his hands instead, and watch the same boy transform completely. Out on the water, the fidgeting stopped. The impatience sharpened into something closer to focus. Cornelius wasn't slow at all once he was out of that classroom. He came alive. He learned the harbor the way other children learn to say their prayers by heart, without effort. He knew exactly where the current ran fast and where it turned dangerous. He could read which wind meant an easy crossing and which one meant trouble was coming. He watched the ferrymen, the traders, the ship captains, and where other people simply saw boats going back and forth, he saw something more, a whole living system of routes and cargo and coins changing hands. Even as a boy, without anyone ever explaining it to him, he understood that all of that motion was really just money in disguise, and that a sharp kid with a fast boat could plant himself right in the middle of it. The smell of it all lived permanently in him: salt water and tar, wet rope, the sharp bite of fish pulled fresh from the nets, the low, ripe smell of a falling tide, wood smoke drifting off the shore, and the sounds: timber creaking, water slapping against a hull, gulls screaming overhead. To the rest of his family, this was just the ordinary backdrop of a working life on the water. To Cornelius, it was the entire world, and he wanted a much bigger slice of it than any farmer's son was supposed to expect. He wasn't a dreamer in the usual sense. He didn't picture fame or luxury. What he pictured, over and over, was simply work, harder work and smarter work than anyone else around him was willing to do, all of it converted relentlessly into gain. He was somewhere around 11 or 12 years old when the first shape of a plan began forming in his head, and it wouldn't take long before that shape hardened into something real. All he needed to start was a boat of his own, and to get one, he'd have to strike a bargain with the one person on Staten Island who was every bit as stubborn as he was: his own mother. At 16. Cornelius went to his mother with a proposal, and she countered with a test. If he could clear, plow, and plan a particularly rocky, worthless field before a set deadline, she'd lend him $100. He did it, recruiting every friend and neighbor he could talk into helping, driving them like a crew boss, and finishing the job with time to spare. With the money, he bought a small, flat-bottomed boat and started ferrying passengers and cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan. The work was cold, wet, and endless, but Cornelius threw himself into it with an intensity that made grown men uneasy. He undercut every competitor's price, worked longer hours than anyone else on the water, and never once complained about the weather. His mother, Phoebe, hadn't been an easy mark, either. She was the one who kept the family's savings locked in a clock case and ran the household with an iron hand, and she hadn't handed her teenage son $100 out of sentiment. She'd deliberately chosen the worst field on the property, stony, neglected ground that broke tools and tempers alike, expecting the task to occupy him for weeks and maybe teach him something about the value of a dollar. Instead, he'd organized an entire crew of neighbors and finished early. It was, in its way, the first real business lesson of his life. A man who could direct other people's labor could accomplish far more than a man working alone ever could. Within a single season on the water, he'd paid his mother back in full and handed her $1,000 on top of it. Then the War of 1812 broke out, and with it came opportunity. The forts scattered around New York Harbor needed constant supplying, and the government was contracting boatmen willing to make the runs, often at night, often in miserable weather. It was dangerous, thankless work, which was exactly why Cornelius wanted it. While other boatmen hesitated, he took the worst routes and the roughest hours and delivered every single time. He built a reputation not for charm, not for cleverness, but for something far more valuable: absolute, unshakable reliability. By the time the war ended, the boy who had started with one borrowed boat commanded a small fleet of his own. He'd also married his cousin Sophia and begun the family that would, decades later, tear itself apart fighting over what he left behind. He was still rough around the edges, still barely literate, still negotiating contracts by ear that he couldn't fully read on paper. But he'd proven the one thing he most needed to prove, that his instincts about water and money weren't the daydreams of a lazy schoolboy. They were the foundation stones of something much larger. He could have stopped there. A prosperous, respected ferryman on Staten Island, comfortable, safe, done. It would have been a perfectly good life. But comfort had never once tempted Cornelius Vanderbilt. Out on the harbor, a strange new kind of vessel was starting to appear, one that didn't need wind at all, one that belched black smoke and pushed against the current under its own furious power. And the moment Cornelius understood what steam could really do, the ferryman set his sights on something far bigger than any fleet of sailboats. As steam power began to spread across America's waterways, Cornelius saw the future taking shape long before almost anyone else noticed it, and he threw himself into that future with a ferocity so intense it earned him a nickname that would stick with him for the rest of his life. People started calling him the Commodore. He built steamboats. He ran them up and down the Hudson River and well beyond it. And he waged brutal, scorched-earth price wars against anyone reckless enough to try competing with him on a route he wanted. His method was almost embarrassingly simple and utterly terrifying to the men on the receiving end of it. He would slash his fares so low that no rival could possibly turn a profit, hold that line until his competitors either collapsed or came begging to buy him off, and then take the money and move on to the next route. He wasn't cruel simply for the pleasure of being cruel. He was a man who understood, with a kind of cold clarity most people never develop, that in business there was no such thing as mercy, only leverage, and the stomach to use it. His education in steam began under someone else's flag. Cornelius went to work for a man named Thomas Gibbons, running a steamboat line that operated in flat defiance of a legal monopoly. A monopoly that, on paper, granted one particular group the exclusive right to run steam vessels through New York's waters. For years, Cornelius captained Gibbons's boats, slipping past authorities, outrunning rivals, learning every corner of the business from the deck upward, hands-on, the only way he ever really learned anything. Then, in 1824, the landmark case of Gibbons versus Ogden reached the Supreme Court. The monopoly was struck down, and the waterways were suddenly thrown wide open to anyone with the nerve to compete in them. Cornelius had spent years preparing for precisely this moment, without even knowing it was coming. He struck out on his own, and what followed was devastating for nearly everyone unlucky enough to be standing in his path. He would move into a route, drop his prices to a point where turning any profit was mathematically impossible, and simply outlast his rivals, enduring losses for months at a stretch if that's what it took to bleed a competitor dry. He lived cheaply himself, spent almost nothing on comfort, and had the iron nerve to keep absorbing losses long after ordinary businessmen would have folded. Often the established shipping lines would simply pay him, hand him a large lump sum just to abandon the route and take his ruinous prices somewhere else. In its own dark way, it was a kind of genius. He discovered that a reputation for merciless competition could itself be sold, again and again, for a fortune, without him ever having to actually finish the fight. The nickname Commodore arrived somewhere in the middle of these years, half mockery, half genuine respect. It was a naval title handed to a man who commanded no navy at all, but who ruled the waterways as completely as if he did. Somehow it fit him perfectly. He was tall, physically imposing, quick-tempered, foul-mouthed, a man who raced trotting horses at dangerous speeds purely for the thrill of it, and who approached ordinary business the same way, as a race to be won at absolutely any cost. When gold was discovered in California, and the whole country seemed to lurch westward at once, Cornelius spotted the next great opportunity glittering on the horizon. Thousands of desperate travelers needed a way to get from the eastern seaboard to the goldfields of California, and the fastest paths ran by sea. He built a bold new route that carried passengers down to Central America. Across the narrow stretch of land in Nicaragua by river and by road, and then back up the Pacific coast to California, deliberately undercutting the established route through Panama and pocketing the difference in fares. It was daring, logistically complicated and enormously profitable, and it carried his name into households across the entire country. By the middle of the 19th century, the Commodore stood among the very richest men in America, a titan of steam who had turned a single borrowed rowboat into a maritime empire spanning thousands of miles. He was already well past the age when most successful men start thinking about retirement. And it was precisely at that moment, at the absolute height of his dominance over the water, that he made the single most surprising decision of his life. But before we follow him onto dry land and the rails, it's worth pausing here in the dark to really understand the man himself, because the fortune that was coming could only have been built by someone quite unlike anyone else of his era. To understand how the Vanderbilt fortune grew into something so monstrously large, you first have to understand the man sitting at the center of it, and the Commodore was never an easy man to understand, let alone to like. He was blunt to the point of rudeness, foul-mouthed, and had no patience whatsoever for anyone who wasted his time. He trusted almost no one in the world, kept his own counsel on everything, and had zero use for the polished manners of the high society that would one day come begging to marry into his family. When business associates tried to cheat him, his response became something of a local legend for its sheer icy simplicity. He'd write to inform them in a few short sentences that he had no intention of suing them because the courts were far too slow. Instead, he told them plainly he intended to ruin them, and almost without exception, he did exactly that. That particular letter wasn't just a story that grew in the retelling. It really happened. While Cornelius was away on one of his rare vacations, a grand tour of Europe aboard a private steam yacht he had built specifically for the trip, two of his own business partners quietly seized control of his profitable Central American transit line behind his back. They assumed an ocean, and a few months' head start would be more than enough time to dig themselves in and make the theft permanent. They badly misjudged the man they were dealing with. When Cornelius returned, he didn't waste a single ounce of energy on outrage or theatrics. He sent them a short, ice-cold note stating plainly that they had tried to cheat him, that suing them would take too long to satisfy him, and that he simply intended to ruin them instead. Then he set about doing precisely that, competing against the stolen enterprise with such savage intensity that he broke it apart and reclaimed everything he considered rightfully his. This was the essence of who he was. He didn't bluster. He didn't make idle threats to sound tough. He stated his intentions plainly, almost politely, and then carried them out with a patience and a coldness that left his enemies genuinely rattled, as if they'd tangled with something not entirely human. He had no real interest in fairness as most people understood the word. He believed in strength, in leverage, in the simple, brutal mathematics of who could endure pain the longest. And having spent his boyhood building an iron stomach for loss during the fairy wars, he could endure almost anything thrown at him. Physically, he remained an imposing figure well into old age, tall, upright, sharp-eyed, with a presence that seemed to fill up any room he walked into. He loved fast horses and raced them himself through the streets, an old man flying behind a team of trotters with all the same wild joy he'd once felt gripping the tiller of a boat as a teenager. He swore constantly, dismissed refinement and polish as a foolish waste of money, and had zero patience for the elaborate social rituals that mattered so much to New York's old money families. While other tycoons of his era collected fine paintings and chased the approval of high society, Cornelius collected businesses instead, and courted almost nobody's approval at all. He wasn't entirely without loyalty, but he doled it out sparingly and revoked it instantly, and without a second thought the moment it was betrayed. Partners who served him well and honestly could prosper alongside him for decades. Partners who crossed him even once were cut off completely and hunted down without mercy. Even his own children learned early that his affection came with strings attached, earned only through the kind of hard, competent, unsentimental work he genuinely respected. Weakness of any kind in a rival, in a partner, or in a son filled him with an open, undisguised contempt, It would be easy, and not entirely wrong, to simply call him a hard and greedy man. He was certainly both of those things. But there was something more underneath it, too, a raw, almost frightening force of will that most human beings simply never possess. He genuinely didn't care whether the world loved him. He cared only about whether he won. And for nearly the entirety of his long life, in nearly every fight he chose to enter, he did win. That same unbending will was about to be turned toward the largest, messiest, most complicated business of the entire age. The Commodore, already an old man and already rich beyond most people's imagination, was about to set his cold eyes on the railroads. By the point in life when most successful men would already have retired to quietly enjoy what they'd built, the Commodore did something that struck nearly everyone around him as close to insane. Already one of the wealthiest men in the entire country, well into his 60s, he began selling off large pieces of his shipping empire and turning his full attention toward a newer, far riskier business: railroads. Steel, steam, and iron were beginning to stitch the whole country together in a way ships never could, and Cornelius understood, almost instinctively, that whoever controlled the tracks would end up controlling the coming age. He bought up railroad companies the exact same way he'd once bought out ferry rivals, aggressively, cleverly, and without a trace of sentiment. The man who had conquered the water had decided, quite calmly, to go conquer the land as well. The logic behind it was pure, unmistakable Vanderbilt. Steamboats had made him rich, but he could see the shape of what was coming as clearly as he'd once read the sky over the harbor as a boy. Rail lines didn't need rivers or coastlines to follow. They could go anywhere, in any weather, and could carry far more freight and far more passengers than any fleet of ships ever could. The men who'd built the early railroads had mostly done so haphazardly, tangled ownership, shaky finances, roots that made little sense together. Cornelius looked at that disorder and saw exactly the kind of opportunity he loved best. Wherever there was chaos, there was a chance for a disciplined, ruthless man to walk in, impose order, and profit enormously from the mess. He started close to home. He took control of the New York and Harlem Railroad, a struggling line whose real value wasn't its length but its precious direct access into the heart of Manhattan itself. Next came the Hudson River Railroad, running up the eastern bank of the great river toward Albany. Piece by piece, he was assembling something much larger than any single line, the same way he'd once assembled a fleet of ships, choosing each new acquisition specifically for how it would fit into the whole. The financial maneuvering of these years became legendary for its sheer cunning. In one particularly famous episode involving the Harlem line, a group of speculators and corrupt politicians conspired to drive the stock price down by breaking an agreement they'd made with Cornelius directly. Rather than panic, Cornelius calmly and quietly bought up nearly every available share on the market. When the schemers went looking to buy stock and cover their bets, they discovered the Commodore already owned almost the entire supply, and they were forced to buy it back from him at absolutely ruinous prices. He turned an attempted swindle into one of the most profitable market corners in American history. Once again, the men who tried to outmaneuver him had only ended up enriching him further. There was a clear pattern running through his entire career. Cornelius rarely started a fight, but he always finished it, and he finished it in a way that guaranteed no one would ever be tempted to try the same trick against him twice. His enemies learned, sometimes at the cost of everything they owned, that crossing him wasn't merely risky. It was financially fatal. By the late 1860s, an old man who still could barely read had quietly gathered into his own hands nearly every crucial rail line feeding into the greatest city in the country. But scattered lines, however individually valuable, weren't yet an empire. They were still separate companies, running on separate schedules, serving separate purposes, useful on their own, but far more powerful if they could be welded together into one single system under one iron will. And the Commodore, now in his 70s, was not the kind of man to leave a job half-finished. He was about to perform an act of consolidation so brazen that people would still be talking about it generations later. The Commodore set his sights on stitching together a tangle of competing, half-connected railroad lines into one unified system, the New York Central, a single spine that would run straight through the heart of the nation's commerce. The New York Central was the true prize here, a major line connecting his existing Hudson River Railroad all the way out to the vast markets of the American West. But its directors had no intention of being quietly absorbed. So Cornelius reached for a weapon that only he was positioned to use, and he chose to use it in the dead of winter, at the exact moment it would hurt the most. The New York Central depended entirely on Vanderbilt's own Hudson River Railroad to carry its passengers and freight that final crucial stretch into New York City itself. The connection crossed the river up near Albany, and so, one bitter winter, Cornelius simply refused to make the connection at all. He ordered his own trains to stop short of the bridge, leaving the New York Central's passengers and freight stranded helplessly on the wrong side of a frozen river. Unable to reach the city that was the entire point of their journey, he claimed with a perfectly straight face that some old technicality of law prevented him from carrying their traffic across. In truth, he was simply strangling them, one frozen day at a time. The effect was immediate and devastating. The New York Central's business collapsed almost overnight. Its stock price crashed. Its directors, humiliated and increasingly desperate, understood all too clearly that the old man had them completely at his mercy, and that he was perfectly willing to leave them there, frozen, for as long as it took. Within a short time, they surrendered outright. Cornelius took control of the very railroad that had refused to bow to him in the first place. He had captured an entire empire, not with a single dollar spent in open combat, but with the simple, merciless act of leaving a bridge closed in the middle of January. With the New York Central now firmly under his control and joined to his other lines, Cornelius commanded a unified railroad system of extraordinary reach and value. He standardized operations across the whole network, cut out waste, improved the physical roads themselves, and ran the entire thing with the same tireless, obsessive attention he'd once poured into a single ferryboat decades earlier. Whatever anyone thought of his methods, he really was a genuinely brilliant operator, and the lines under his control became more efficient and more profitable than they'd ever been under their previous, scattered ownership. To crown the whole achievement, and to give it a face the public could actually see, he ordered the construction of a great central depot in New York City, an enormous structure of iron and glass rising up over the tracks, gathering all his lines together beneath one magnificent roof. Grand Central, as it came to be called, opened in the early 1870s and announced to the entire country that the Vanderbilt name no longer belonged just to a wealthy man, but to the very infrastructure the nation ran on. Travelers passed beneath that roof by the thousands, every single day. The name Vanderbilt had stopped being merely rich. It was now woven directly into the map itself. There's a certain grandeur to what the Commodore built in this final chapter of his working life, and a certain irony sitting right alongside it. This profane, barely literate old man who cared nothing at all for beauty and openly scorned the refinements of polite society had built something that would end up outlasting nearly every mansion his own descendants would ever raise. The palaces would fall, one after another. The great station, rebuilt and beloved, would still be standing. But the man who built it all was never truly a happy man, and the house he ruled behind closed doors was a far colder, far more troubled place than the bustling terminal that still carries his name. To understand the fall that's coming, we have to step out of the boardroom now, and into the family, into the house where the Commodore's greatest failures were quietly waiting all along. For all his genius when it came to money, the Commodore's home life was a far colder, far sadder place than any of his ledgers ever revealed. He married his own cousin, Sophia Johnson, when they were both still young, and together the couple had 13 children, a house overflowing with sons and daughters, all of them growing up in the enormous shadow of a father who almost never offered them any real warmth. He worked constantly, dominated every room he entered, and made no effort at all to hide his disappointment in most of the children he'd fathered. He wanted heirs who were exactly as hard and as sharp as he was, and more often than not, he came away unsatisfied. It turned out that wealth, no matter how vast, could buy a family almost anything in the world except the one thing the Commodore never quite figured out how to give. Sophia carried the weight of that household for decades, largely on her own. She raised the children, managed the endless domestic chaos of a home that size, and endured a husband whose attention was almost entirely fixed on the water and later on the rails. She was capable, patient, and long-suffering, and her reward for a lifetime of quiet loyalty was a marriage in which she was expected to obey without question or complaint. In one particularly dark episode late in their life together, when she resisted a plan of his that she strongly disagreed with, Cornelius reportedly had her confined for a period of time. A chilling reminder that the same force that crushed his business rivals didn't stop at the front door of his own home. It could turn just as cold, just as immovable on the people who loved him. His daughters, of whom there were many, were largely raised with one purpose in mind: to marry well, and to expect very little from the fortune itself. In the Commodore's mind, the great work of the family dynasty had to pass through a son, and so his daughters were, in the brutal arithmetic of his thinking, treated as secondary from the start. Several of them would go on to feel the full sting of that thinking when his will was finally read aloud, and more than one of them would fight it in open court. But that particular reckoning was still years away. It was among his sons, though, that the Commodore's coldness did its deepest and most lasting damage. He measured every one of them relentlessly against his own impossible standard, and most of them, in his eyes, simply fell short. The one who suffered the most under that weight was Cornelius Jeremiah, a son struggling with poor health and drawn toward gambling, a young man who seemed, in nearly every way, to embody exactly what his father despised most in another human being. Where the old man saw weakness, he offered no patience, no comfort, nothing at all but open contempt. The relationship between father and son was a wound that never came close to healing, and it would end, years after the old man himself was gone, in genuine tragedy. There was, however, one son the Commodore had long since written off, and would eventually, grudgingly, come to respect. William Henry had been sent away as a young man, judged too soft and far too slow for the rough world of the family business, and exiled to manage a modest farm out on Staten Island. For years, his father regarded him as a plain disappointment. But out on that farm, quietly and without a single word of complaint, William Henry made the place succeed. He managed its finances with real care and real shrewdness, and slowly, over the course of many years, he earned something from his father that almost none of his siblings ever managed to receive: genuine respect. When Sophia eventually died, the aging Commodore did something that scandalized both his family and the wider public. He remarried, taking as his second wife a much younger cousin named Frank Armstrong Crawford, a woman young enough to have been his granddaughter. It was a decision that only deepened the resentment already simmering among his many children, who watched with growing anxiety as their father's affections, and more worryingly, his fortune, seemed to be drifting further and further out of their reach. By the 1870s, the Commodore was very old and very, very rich, presiding over a family held together by money and pulled apart by decades of coldness. He had built the single greatest fortune in the history of America. What he had never managed to build was a family capable of actually holding on to it. And when death finally came for him, the true shape of his intentions for that fortune would be revealed in full, and the long, bitter fight over the Vanderbilt inheritance would begin in earnest. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in January of 1877 at the age of 82, leaving behind a fortune of roughly $100 million, a sum so staggering for its time that people genuinely said it was larger than the entire Treasury of the United States government. No American had ever died anywhere near that rich before, but the Commodore, ever the ruthless strategist right up to his final breath, did not divide his empire evenly among his 13 children. He believed with total conviction that splitting a great fortune only weakened it. So he made a decision that would break hearts, spark lawsuits, and shape the family's fate for the next century. He left almost the entire fortune to a single son. His final illness dragged on for months, long and painful, and he faced it with exactly the same stubbornness that had defined every other struggle of his long life. He clung on, tended in his own New York home, refusing to give in easily, even to death itself. Outside, the newspapers speculated endlessly about the true size of his fortune, and about what his will might actually say, because the whole country understood, on some level, that the death of the Commodore wasn't simply the passing of one very rich old man. It was the transfer of an almost unimaginable amount of wealth and power to whoever came next. When he finally died in the first days of the new year, the news traveled across the country within hours. And when the will was finally read aloud, it confirmed exactly what many had quietly feared and few had dared to say out loud. Of the roughly $100 million, the overwhelming majority, somewhere around $95 million, went straight to his son, William Henry. A further portion was set aside specifically for William Henry's own sons, ensuring the great bulk of the fortune would stay concentrated in that one single branch of the family for another generation still. The rest of the Commodore's enormous family, his many daughters, his other sons, received comparatively modest sums. Amounts that would have felt like a fortune to any ordinary family in America, but that looked almost like an insult standing next to the mountain of money handed to William Henry alone. The reasoning behind it was cold, and entirely consistent with everything the Commodore had ever believed. He had watched other great fortunes crumble away to nothing once they were carved up into equal pieces and scattered among a dozen heirs, each portion too small on its own to hold any real power. He was determined that his own empire would not suffer the same slow death. By keeping it whole and placing it entirely in the hands of the one child he judged genuinely competent to run it, he believed he was protecting his life's work. In his own mind, he wasn't being cruel at all. He was simply being strategic, doing in death exactly what he had always done in life, refusing to let sentiment weaken a sound and carefully considered plan. He could not have known, or perhaps simply did not care, that he was also quietly planting the seeds of decades of bitterness to come. To be born a Vanderbilt from this point forward meant inheriting not just the possibility of enormous wealth, but very nearly the certainty of resentment, the sense of having been passed over, of measuring yourself endlessly against a sibling or a cousin who had simply received more. The family's entire relationship with money would forever be tangled up with a lingering sense of grievance, an unanswered question of who truly deserved what and why. For one brief moment, though, the old man's plan appeared to work exactly as he'd intended. The empire passed intact into William Henry's hands, a capable, careful man who genuinely understood the railroads and respected the fortune he'd just inherited. The dynasty had survived its own founder. The great machine kept turning, but the will had left far too many people angry, and the sums of money involved were simply too enormous for anyone to accept quietly. Almost immediately, whispers of a legal challenge began to spread. Two of the Commodore's own children, unwilling to let their father's final decision stand unopposed, prepared to drag their family's most private affairs into open court, and the entire nation, hungry as ever for a good scandal, leaned in eagerly to watch. The son the Commodore had ultimately chosen was William Henry, the very child he'd once dismissed as a hopeless failure, and only much later grudgingly come to trust. The rest received comparatively modest sums, and a number of them were absolutely furious about it. His daughter Mary Alicia, along with his troubled son Cornelius Jeremiah, formally challenged the will in a sensational public trial that dragged every private detail of the family straight into the newspapers. There were accusations flying in every direction of insanity, of spiritualist trickery, of undue influence, of hidden schemes cooked up behind closed doors. The proceedings became a full-blown public spectacle, feeding a public that couldn't get enough of the private miseries of the extremely rich. In the end, William Henry kept nearly all of it, but the family had already learned a lesson it would carry with it for generations to come. A Vanderbilt fortune, it turned out, always came bundled together with Vanderbilt wounds. The strategy pursued by those challenging the will was simple enough on paper, even if it proved nearly impossible to prove in practice. They argued that the old man had not been of sound mind when he made his final arrangements, and that William Henry had exerted improper, almost sinister influence over a father whose judgment, they claimed, had been quietly failing for years. To build that case, the lawyers aired the strangest and most intimate details of the Commodore's later life for the entire country to read over breakfast, and the public devoured every single word of it. It emerged, to the shock of many, that this hard-headed titan of steam and steel, a man who scorned sentiment, who had no time whatsoever for softness of any kind, had developed, in his final years, a genuine and deep fascination with spiritualism. He consulted mediums. He attended seances, hopping in some private corner of himself to make contact with the dead, very possibly with Sophia, the wife whose obedience he had once demanded and whose company he had, in his own strange way, come to miss. Chief among the figures who'd captured the aging Commodore's attention were two remarkable sisters who claimed the ability to speak with spirits, and who moved for a time within his circle of trusted confidants. To the lawyers building the case against the will, this was pure gold. Here, they argued, was living proof that the great man had grown credulous in his old age, manipulated by charlatans and possibly by scheming relatives working in concert with them, perhaps even genuinely unfit of mind, by the time he signed his final wishes. They painted a vivid portrait for the jury of a fortune quietly stolen from its rightful heirs through trickery and sustained emotional pressure. William Henry's defense, by contrast, was far calmer, and in the end, far more effective. He and his lawyers simply presented the Commodore as exactly what he had always been throughout his entire public life: a shrewd, stubborn, entirely rational man who had made a deliberate, carefully reasoned choice about the future of his own empire. An interest in spiritualism, however eccentric it might look from the outside, did not by itself make a man legally insane. And the concentration of the fortune into a single pair of capable hands was, in fact, perfectly in keeping with everything the Commodore had believed and practiced his entire working life. The will, William Henry's team argued, was not the confused product of a broken mind. It was the final, deliberate act of a mind that had never once stopped calculating. The trial dragged on for weeks and gripped the entire country, but the eventual outcome was really never in serious doubt. The evidence of the Commodore's continued competence right up until his death was overwhelming, and William Henry, already holding nearly the entire fortune, along with every legal advantage that came bundled with it, sat in an almost unassailable position from the very start. Rather than risk years of continued, embarrassing litigation, he chose instead to quietly settle with several of the aggrieved relatives, increasing their individual shares just enough to buy peace and finally bring the public spectacle to a close. It was a shrewd move on his part, resolving the entire messy affair without ever seriously threatening his own control over the empire. For Cornelius Jeremiah, though, the outcome was especially bitter to swallow. The son his father had always regarded with open contempt had gambled, quite literally, given his history, on overturning the will entirely, and he had lost. He received only a modest income out of the settlement, nothing at all like the fortune he'd once hoped to claim. A few years later, still burdened by poor health and by a lifetime spent feeling fundamentally unworthy in his own father's eyes, he took his own life. It was a quiet, sorrowful footnote tucked away at the edges of the great courtroom drama, a small human reminder that behind every one of those enormous numbers argued over in that courtroom were real people, marked in ways that no amount of money could ever hope to mend. With the legal challenge finally defeated and the settlements paid out, the fortune remained fully intact in William Henry's hands. The dynasty had passed its very first great test. And now the quiet, careful son who had once been written off entirely as a failure held the largest private fortune in the whole of America, along with, at long last, the chance to prove exactly what he was truly capable of. William Henry Vanderbilt had spent much of his life being quietly underestimated, first by his own father, and then, almost automatically, by everyone else around him. What nobody expected was that this careful, unassuming man would go on to prove himself an even shrewder steward of money than the Commodore himself had ever been. In roughly 8 years at the helm, William Henry very nearly doubled the family fortune, growing it to somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million. He expanded the railroad network, invested with real wisdom and discipline, and managed the entire sprawling empire with a remarkably steady hand throughout. In pure financial terms, this brief window represented the absolute high-water mark of the entire Vanderbilt dynasty. Never again, at any point afterward, would the family be quite this rich, or quite this disciplined with what they had. He'd come to the role rather late, and by an unusually strange road for a man who would end up running the largest fortune in the country. As a young man, remember, he'd been exiled out to a Staten Island farm, judged far too gentle and far too slow for the rough, cutthroat world of Vanderbilt business. For years, he lived a modest, quiet agricultural life while his father built an empire back in the city. But those years on the farm hadn't been wasted at all. Out there, William Henry had quietly learned patience, careful management, and the distinctly unglamorous discipline required to make an ordinary, unremarkable concern turn a steady, reliable profit year after year. When he finally entered the family business in earnest and began demonstrating his real abilities, even the deeply skeptical Commodore was eventually forced to admit that his long-overlooked son possessed a genuine gift for the work. Now holding the entire fortune in his own hands, William Henry set about proving that gift on the grandest possible scale available to him. He understood the railroad business intimately, down to its smallest operational details, and he ran the whole network with a careful combination of caution and genuine ambition that suited the era perfectly. He extended existing lines, strengthened the underlying finances of his various companies, and navigated the often treacherous world of railroad competition and high finance with a skill that rivaled, and in some specific ways actually surpassed, his own father's. Where the Commodore had been all fire, aggression, and brute force, William Henry was measured, deliberate, and quietly relentless in his own way, and the numbers spoke for themselves. In the space of just a few short years, he added roughly $100 million to a fortune that was already, by a wide margin, the largest in the entire country. The scale of it is genuinely difficult to grasp, even looking back now with modern eyes. He commanded a level of personal wealth that gave him real influence over the economy of the entire nation, and he wielded that influence with a steadiness that kept the empire not only intact, but actively growing year after year. For this brief window in time, the Vanderbilt fortune reached a peak that would never, ever be matched again by any generation that followed, a genuine summit of both money and disciplined management, arriving together at exactly the same moment. But even as he doubled the family's wealth, subtle changes were already quietly taking hold underneath the surface, changes that would matter enormously in the years still to come. William Henry simply didn't share his father's iron indifference to comfort and public display. He began spending money in ways the old Commodore never once had, building a truly grand home on Fifth Avenue and assembling one of the finest private art collections anywhere in America, surrounding himself with European masterpieces and every refinement that money could possibly purchase. He was still, at his core, a fundamentally disciplined man, still fundamentally a builder of wealth rather than merely a spender of it. But he had quietly opened a door that his own children would soon come charging straight through. The relentless strain of managing such a vast empire weighed on him heavily, more heavily than most people around him ever realized. He was not, by this point, a young man anymore when he inherited the fortune, and the pressure of overseeing so much wealth took a visible, physical toll on his health as the years wore on. He confided, quietly, to those closest to him that carrying the burden of the fortune brought him surprisingly little genuine happiness. That caring for so much money was, in its own strange way, a kind of prison he could never quite escape. He had done exactly what his father asked of him, and he had done it magnificently, by any reasonable measure. But some part of him seemed to sense that the great, disciplined age of the Vanderbilts was quietly reaching its natural end with him. He was right. William Henry would not live long enough to properly enjoy the peak he himself had reached, and when the time came to pass the fortune onward, he would do so in a way that finally let the great river of Vanderbilt money begin to spread out, and slowly, gradually, begin to thin. The age of building the fortune was very nearly over. The age of spending it was just about to begin. For all his considerable skill as a businessman, William Henry accidentally handed the entire family a single phrase that would haunt its public reputation for decades afterward. Traveling by train in the early 1880s, he was pressed by a persistent reporter about whether his company ran a particular fast, expensive service purely for the benefit of the general public. Tired, irritable, and clearly caught off guard, he snapped back a reply that the newspapers seized on with obvious glee. A blunt declaration that the public could, in his own words, be damned, that he worked for his stockholders, and for absolutely no one else. Whether he'd been genuinely misquoted, or was simply exhausted in the moment, hardly seemed to matter once the words were in print. That single phrase captured something the entire country was already beginning to feel about the age of the great industrial tycoons, a growing sense that these men saw ordinary working people as little more than obstacles, rather than as fellow citizens deserving of any real consideration. The remark had actually been made almost carelessly, in passing. William Henry had been discussing a costly express train his company intended to discontinue because it was steadily losing money, and the reporter, sensing the makings of a good story, had asked whether the railroad owed it to the public to keep running the service anyway, profit or no profit. To a man who had spent his entire life measuring everything in terms of profit and loss, the question itself struck him as almost absurd on its face. He wasn't running a public charity. He was the head of a business that answered, first and foremost, to the people who had invested their own money in it. And so, he gave the perfectly honest answer of a hard-headed businessman, never once imagining how those exact words would look splashed across the front pages of newspapers nationwide. It sounded absolutely terrible in print. Torn completely out of its original context and set in bold type, the phrase became an instant national symbol for everything ordinary Americans had come to quietly resent about the enormously rich men who controlled the railroads, the mines, the mills, and seemingly the government itself, from behind the scenes. This was, after all, a period in American history when a small handful of families had managed to accumulate fortunes utterly beyond ordinary comprehension, while working people all across the country labored long, brutal hours for genuinely meager wages, and resentment against the wealthy elite was steadily building across the entire land. Into that already simmering public mood dropped four short, careless words that seemed to confirm everyone's darkest suspicions all at once. The rich, it appeared to prove, simply did not care about the public. The rich, it seemed, actually wished the public damned. William Henry was, by most honest accounts from people who actually knew him, not a particularly arrogant man at all. He was reserved by nature, careful in his dealings, and privately rather uncomfortable with the sheer weight of his own inherited wealth. But none of that mattered anymore once the phrase had taken hold in the public imagination. It attached itself permanently to him, and through him to the entire Vanderbilt name, a stain that no amount of careful philanthropy or genuinely skilled management could ever quite manage to scrub away. Critics would wield that single phrase against the family for decades to come. Political cartoonists drew it. Social reformers quoted it constantly in speeches. It became, almost overnight, a kind of national shorthand for the contempt the powerful were widely assumed to feel toward the powerless. There's something genuinely tragic in the way a single weary, off-the-cuff sentence could end up outweighing an entire lifetime of real, substantial achievement. William Henry had doubled the greatest private fortune in America and managed a truly vast business enterprise with real, demonstrable skill. And yet what the public chose to remember wasn't his competence at all, but his apparent contempt, real or badly imagined, expressed in one unguarded moment aboard a moving train. In an age long before careful public relations, long before the polished, deliberate management of a family's public image, a rich man really could destroy his own reputation with nothing more than a careless shrug and a single sentence. The whole episode revealed a hard truth that the Vanderbilts, as a family, would go on learning again and again in the years still ahead of them. Their money made them enormously visible to the public, and their visibility, in turn, made them permanent targets. Every extravagance, every misstep, every careless word spoken in an unguarded moment would be magnified, repeated, and remembered by a public that was watching far more closely than they ever seemed to realize. The higher the family climbed, the more the whole world watched them do it, and the world, it turned out, was not especially inclined toward mercy. William Henry had felt that particular sting of public scrutiny sharply, and it never entirely left him. His own children, raised in even greater luxury than he himself had known, would soon go on to test the public's patience far more severely still, and they would do it not with careless words this time, but with something far more permanent, with marble. William Henry poured a substantial portion of his enormous wealth into a magnificent private art collection and a truly grand mansion on Fifth Avenue, surrounding himself with European paintings and every comfort that money could possibly summon. His home was a vast, splendid structure, part of a connected row of palaces he built for both himself and his children, filled with imported tapestries, fine sculpture, and a private gallery hung floor to ceiling with canvases by the great painters of Europe. For a man who had spent his early life on a modest farm doing unglamorous, hands-on work, it was a startling transformation, a quiet but unmistakable declaration that the once overlooked son had finally arrived at the very summit of American life. But the strain of managing an empire of that size caught up with him faster than anyone around him had expected. His art collection was, in its own way, a small sign of the changing spirit taking hold within the family. The Commodore had always scorned that kind of thing, seeing in a painting only a foolish way to lock up money that could otherwise be put to productive work. William Henry saw something entirely different in it. He genuinely wanted beauty, refinement, the outward trappings of a cultivated life, the particular kind of respect that comes from being seen as a man of taste and not merely a man of raw money. He assembled his collection with real enthusiasm, opening his private gallery to visitors on occasion and taking genuine pride in what he'd gathered over the years. It was still, in its way, a disciplined man's indulgence, funded entirely from a fortune. He continued actively growing even while he spent. But it marked a real shift underway within the family, a softening, a slow turning of Vanderbilt eyes away from the ledger book and toward the luxuries that money could actually buy. He had 8 children of his own, and as he grew older, his thoughts naturally turned toward how the great fortune should eventually pass down to them. Here, he made a choice that differed sharply from his own father's. Where the Commodore had concentrated nearly everything into a single heir, William Henry chose instead to divide his wealth far more broadly among his children. His 4 daughters and his 4 sons all received substantial fortunes of their own, generous provisions that would have made any one of them rich beyond the wildest dreams of an ordinary person. The largest shares, along with actual control of the railroad businesses, went to his 2 eldest sons, Cornelius II and William Kissam. But every single child was lavishly provided for in the end. It was, in many ways, a more humane decision than his own father's had been, and perhaps a genuinely fairer one, too. But it was also, in the cold and unforgiving logic of dynastic wealth, the very first crack in the dam. A fortune concentrated entirely in one pair of hands could remain a mighty, unified force for generations. A fortune split 8 separate ways, and destined to be split again among all of their own children in turn, would inevitably thin out with each passing generation, no matter how large the original sum had been. His own end, when it finally came, arrived suddenly and without any real warning at all. In late 1885, while meeting with a business associate inside his own Fifth Avenue home, William Henry collapsed and died within moments, felled by a sudden stroke at the age of 64. He had held the great fortune for only about 8 years in which he'd managed to double it, and then, just as quietly, begun the process of dispersing it outward. The disciplined age of the Vanderbilts effectively died there with him, on the floor of his own splendid mansion, surrounded by the very paintings he had loved so much. He left behind children who had never known anything in their lives except immense, effortless wealth, children who had never once rode a ferry against a cold current, never endured a brutal price war, never worked a stubborn, rocky field into something profitable. They inherited the money, and they inherited the famous name, but they did not inherit the hunger, and they most certainly did not inherit the discipline. The fortune was now entirely theirs to enjoy. And enjoy it, as it turned out, they very much would. William Henry, like his own father before him, divided his fortune among his children, though considerably more generously than the Commodore ever had. And this new generation of Vanderbilts, born into a wealth they had never once had to earn for themselves, looked out at the mountain of money now sitting in front of them and asked a very different kind of question than any of their ancestors ever had. The Commodore had asked how to build a fortune from nothing. William Henry had asked how to responsibly grow one that already existed. The grandchildren, for their part, simply asked how best to enjoy it. They were charming, well-educated, culturally sophisticated, and utterly, unshakably convinced that the family fortune was essentially bottomless. And so they set out, each in their own way, to prove exactly that through mansions, through yachts, through glittering ballrooms, and through a hunger for social glory that would end up consuming absolutely vast rivers of Vanderbilt gold. It's worth pausing here for a moment to really understand just how completely different their world was from that of the family's original founder. The Commodore had grown up smelling salt water and tar, had gone out to work as a barefoot boy, had built literally everything with his own 2 hands and his own raw nerve. His grandchildren, by stark contrast, grew up inside actual palaces, waited on hand and foot by armies of household servants, carefully tutored in foreign languages and refined manners, and taught from the earliest possible age that they belonged, by simple birthright, at the very top of American society. They had never once known real want. They had never known genuine struggle. They had never received the sharp, humbling education that only failure can actually teach a person. Money, to them, was not something that ever had to be earned. It was simply the air they breathed every single day, as constant and as unremarkable to them as the weather outside their windows. This wasn't, in itself, some kind of moral failing on their part. They hadn't chosen the exact circumstances of their own birth any more than the Commodore himself had chosen his. But it produced, generation after generation, a family with a fundamentally different relationship to wealth than the one that had originally built it. To their grandfather, a single dollar had been a tool, a weapon, a seed to be carefully planted and patiently grown into something larger. To them, a dollar was simply a means of self-expression, a way to build beauty, to command respect from their peers, and to loudly announce their rightful place in the world. Many of them were. In fairness, genuinely cultivated and thoughtful people, real patrons of the arts, builders of remarkable and beautiful things. But almost none of them possessed even the faintest natural instinct for actually making money, only for spending it, magnificently and without hesitation. And spend it they absolutely did. The great American industrial fortunes of this particular era had together created an entirely new kind of aristocracy, a social class of families who, between them, commanded more raw wealth than the old royal houses of Europe ever had. And these new American families competed fiercely with one another in a dazzling, never-ending contest of public display. Who could build the single grandest house? Who could throw the most lavish, most talked-about party of the season? Who could marry their children into the noblest European bloodlines available? Who could own the finest, fastest yacht on the water? The Vanderbilts, sitting on their enormous fortune and still carrying the fresh, stinging memory of once being looked down on as vulgar newcomers to real society, threw themselves into this glittering contest with a particular, almost desperate ferocity. For a time, the family's railroad holdings still generated genuinely vast amounts of income, and that steady flow of money was so enormous that even the most prodigious, reckless spending couldn't come close to exhausting it. The two brothers who'd formally inherited control of the businesses, Cornelius II and William Kissam, continued managing the family's core enterprises, and the great machine kept right on turning out fresh wealth, year after year. But increasingly, the family's real energy and attention flowed not into the businesses that actually generated the money, but into ever more spectacular and elaborate ways of simply getting rid of it. The true center of gravity within the family had quietly shifted, almost without anyone noticing, from the boardroom over to the ballroom. There was a certain innocence buried inside all of it, and also, looking back now, a certain unmistakable sense of doom. They genuinely believed the fortune was inexhaustible, that a family this staggeringly rich could simply never become anything but rich, that the money would somehow always be there no matter how freely it continued flowing outward. It was, in fairness, a perfectly reasonable enough assumption to make, for people who had genuinely never once seen the world any other way. But great fortunes are not laws of nature, fixed and permanent. They are living, breathing things that must be continuously fed, and a fortune that only ever gets spent and is never actively replenished will eventually die. The third generation, in all of its dazzling, glittering confidence, was about to go build the single most beautiful monument to that hard, inescapable truth that America had ever seen. It began by the sea, in the exclusive summer colony of Newport, Rhode Island. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the eldest of the grandsons, took the entire family's obsession with grandeur and display to breathtaking new heights that no Vanderbilt before him had ever attempted. In Newport, he built a summer home called the Breakers, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace set directly overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, filled with fine marble imported from across Europe, rooms of gilded ceilings, and interiors specifically designed to intimidate visitors just as much as they were meant to impress them. It was called with a completely straight face by everyone involved, a cottage, a word Newport's high society used, without a hint of irony, for private homes far larger than many actual hotels. The Breakers was never really a home in any ordinary sense of that word at all. It was, in every meaningful way, a statement carved permanently in stone and gold, declaring loudly to the entire country that the Vanderbilts had truly arrived at the very summit of American society. Cornelius II was, of all the brothers in his generation, the most serious-minded and arguably the most genuinely devout. He had inherited direct leadership of the core family businesses and took that responsibility with real gravity and care. A church-going, hard-working man who might, in a different century entirely, have closely resembled his own disciplined grandfather. And yet even he could not fully resist the powerful pull of his own age, the deep compulsion to build on a scale grand enough to announce, unmistakably, the family's total supremacy to the entire watching world. When an earlier house standing on the same site burned down in a fire, he seized the sudden opportunity to raise something far grander in its place, hearing the single most celebrated architect working anywhere in the country to design him a palace genuinely worthy of a Renaissance prince. The finished result was simply staggering. The great central hall rose several full stories toward a painted ceiling designed to resemble an open sky overhead. The finest craftsmen anywhere in Europe were specifically commissioned to carve the stonework, mold the ornate plaster, and gild every inch of the endless ornamentation throughout the house. Rare marbles were shipped entirely across the ocean for the project. Whole finished rooms were designed, built, and shipped over from France, then carefully reassembled piece by piece inside the American house. There was a dedicated music room, a dining room of almost overwhelming splendor, a private morning room lined entirely in platinum. The house was quietly equipped with all the most modern conveniences available at the time: electricity, elaborate indoor plumbing, all of it carefully hidden behind the building's old-world exterior magnificence. And all of this, worth remembering, was built purely as a summer home, a place occupied for perhaps a few weeks out of each year, while the family escaped the worst of the city heat. This was the strange, almost dreamlike logic that governed Newport during this era, where the very richest families in the entire country built enormous private palaces they insisted on calling cottages, and then used them for only the briefest possible slice of the calendar year. These houses were never really built for ordinary living. They were built for competing with one another, for hosting elaborate parties, for serving as stages upon which the great social drama of the Gilded Age could be performed, night after night, in front of an audience made up entirely of equally wealthy rivals. The cost of building, and then endlessly maintaining, a place like this was almost beyond ordinary reckoning. Beyond the millions spent purely on construction, there was the never-ending expense of basic upkeep, of the vast household staff required just to keep the place running day to day, of the constant entertaining that was really the entire house's whole reason for existing in the first place. A house like the Breakers didn't merely cost a fortune to build. It devoured a fresh fortune every single year just to maintain, whether the family happened to be in residence at the time or not. Each one of these palaces became a permanent, bottomless drain, a beautiful, endlessly hungry mouth that had to be fed forever, year after year, with no end in sight. The Breakers still stands today, carefully preserved and open to the public, and visitors still wander its grand halls in genuine awe at the sheer scale of the ambition it represents. It really is a masterpiece, undeniably, a monument to a moment in history when a single American family commanded enough resources to build almost like the Medici once had. But seen from a certain angle, it's also a monument to something else entirely, to the exact moment when the Vanderbilts finally stopped growing their fortune and began instead, with tremendous elegance and taste, pouring it steadily into the ground. And it was far from the only palace of its kind. Just down the shoreline, another Vanderbilt brother and his own remarkably formidable wife were busy building a palace of their own, and behind that second house lay a story of personal ambition that would prove, in its own way, even fiercer still. Another of the Vanderbilt grandsons, William Kissam Vanderbilt, had married a woman who would go on to become one of the single most formidable forces in the entire family's long history. Her name was Alva, and she possessed a will every bit as iron and unyielding as the old Commodore's own had ever been, except hers was aimed not at railroads, but directly at high society itself. Alva understood something that the men of the family had somehow consistently overlooked for years. The Vanderbilts now had all the money in the entire world at their disposal, and yet the oldest, snobbiest inner circles of New York society still quietly looked down on them as vulgar, uncultured newcomers, tradespeople who simply happened, through luck or hustle, to have become rich. Alva decided, with total and cold determination, that this simply would not stand any longer. She would spend whatever it took, however much money was required, to force the closed doors of society wide open, and she happened to have access to a nearly limitless fortune with which to do exactly that. Alva had come originally from the South, from a family of some genuine social standing, whose fortunes had been badly damaged by the Civil War and its long, difficult aftermath. She knew firsthand, from painful personal experience, exactly what it felt like to have real social position without any money to back it up, and she was absolutely determined never again to be vulnerable in that particular way. Her marriage to William Kissam gave her direct access to one of the single greatest fortunes on the entire earth, and she fully intended to use every last dollar of it to secure a social position that no future misfortune could ever again take away from her. She was intelligent, forceful, strategic, and completely unafraid of confrontation, qualities that made her both genuinely formidable and, to a great many people around her, deeply intimidating to deal with. William Kissam himself, by sharp contrast, was an easygoing man, fond of yachting and horse racing and all the other pleasant, unhurried occupations enjoyed by the very rich. He was perfectly content to let his own fortune quietly fund a comfortable life of leisure. He didn't share his wife's burning, restless social ambition in the slightest, but he also never once stood in her way, and his money became the fuel that powered nearly everything she went on to attempt. In this particular marriage, it was unmistakably Alva who supplied all of the drive. She was the strategist, the general in the field, the one who understood on some deep level that social power, exactly like any other form of power, could be seized outright by anyone bold enough to actually take it. The problem she faced was very real and quite specific in its shape. New York society during this era was governed by a small, tightly closed circle of old money families who traced their own social standing back many generations, and who openly regarded the newly rich industrial fortunes flooding into the city with real disdain. To this entrenched old guard, the Vanderbilts were nothing more than parvenus, people whose money still smelled faintly of steamboat grease and railroad soot, entirely unfit for the city's most exclusive drawing rooms, no matter how many millions of dollars they happened to control. The reigning, self-appointed queen of this particular social world kept a famously exclusive list of families deemed genuinely acceptable, and the Vanderbilts, despite everything, were still nowhere to be found on it. For a woman with Alva's fierce pride, that ongoing exclusion was simply intolerable to live with. She had married directly into the richest family in all of America, and still found the single most important social door in the entire city politely, firmly closed against her. Money alone, she came to realize, clearly wasn't enough on its own. Society had to be conquered outright, the exact same way her own husband's grandfather had once conquered the railroads through pure strategy, sheer force of will, and a willingness to spend on a scale that would leave her rivals genuinely reeling in shock. She would not beg for acceptance from anyone. She would compel it, whether they liked it or not. Her entire plan took shape around a single spectacular event, a party so grand, so exclusive, and so lavishly staged that all of fashionable New York would find itself absolutely desperate to be invited. A party she could use, quite deliberately, as a weapon to finally break open the closed ranks of the city's old aristocracy. It would end up costing an astonishing sum of money, more than most ordinary families earned across an entire lifetime, spent entirely on a single night of elaborate costumes, live music, and pure spectacle. But Alva understood correctly that this was never really about throwing a party at all. It was about raw power, about forcing the reigning queen of society herself to publicly acknowledge the Vanderbilts as genuine equals at last. And she had chosen both her moment and her exact method, with all the cold precision of a born military commander. In the early 1880s, Alva Vanderbilt threw a costume ball so extravagant, so staggeringly expensive, that it effectively dazzled the whole of New York's high society into finally, formally accepting the family into its ranks. She spent an enormous sum of money on the newly completed mansion that hosted the event, on the elaborate costumes, on the flowers, the food, and every last detail of the spectacle. And in one true masterstroke of social warfare, she quietly let it be known that the reigning grand dame of old New York society would not receive an invitation to the ball at all. Not unless she first personally paid a formal social call on the Vanderbilts, something she had steadfastly refused to do for years. The proud old queen, unwilling to watch her own daughter miss out on what was already being called the party of the century, finally surrendered. With that single evening, Alva had won outright. The Vanderbilts were no longer outsiders looking in. They were, from that night forward, treated as royalty. The setting itself had been carefully chosen as a weapon in its own right. Alva had commissioned a vast, breathtaking mansion on Fifth Avenue, a genuine French chateau rising up dramatically among the brownstones of Manhattan, and she had deliberately timed the completion of this new palace to coincide precisely with her great social offensive. The house was designed, quite intentionally, to overwhelm every guest who walked through its doors, and it succeeded completely. When the invited guests finally arrived on the night of the ball, they stepped into an entire world built from imported stone and hand-carved wood, and every conceivable luxury that money could summon. A stage set worthy of the dramatic performance Alva fully intended to deliver. The ball itself was planned on a scale New York had genuinely never witnessed before. More than 1,000 guests were formally invited, all of them dressed in elaborate custom costumes commissioned specially from the very finest dressmakers in the city, some so intricate in their design that they took months of careful work to prepare. There were formal quadrilles rehearsed for weeks in advance, entire rooms filled floor to ceiling with fresh flowers, and music and dancing and feasting that carried on deep into the early hours of the morning. The city's newspapers, fed careful advance word of the coming event, worked the general public into an absolute frenzy of anticipation in the weeks leading up to it. To receive an invitation was to be publicly confirmed as a genuine member of the city's very highest society. To be left off the list entirely was a real, lasting humiliation. And it was here, exactly at this point, that Alva sprang her carefully laid trap. The daughter of the reigning society queen desperately wanted to attend, as did essentially every fashionable young person in the entire city. But Alva made sure it was clearly understood that no invitation could possibly be extended to the young woman, because her own mother had never once formally called upon Mrs. Vanderbilt, had, in fact, never acknowledged the family socially at all, in all the years since their marriage. Under the rigid social etiquette of the time, this was a genuinely devastating maneuver to face. The great society lady could not secure her own daughter's place at the single most important event of the entire social season without first humbling herself completely, without finally paying the very social call she had spent years stubbornly refusing to make. Faced with her own daughter's mounting distress, and the very real prospect of total exclusion from the one event everyone in the city would be talking about for years afterward, the reigning queen of society finally capitulated completely. She sent her calling card over to the Vanderbilt house, a small but enormously significant gesture that formally signified genuine social recognition at last, an open acknowledgement that the family was now to be counted, officially, among the truly acceptable. It was, in every sense, a total and complete victory. By forcing that single social call, Alva had compelled the entire old aristocracy to open its ranks and formally admit the Vanderbilts as genuine equals. The old exclusion was finally over. The doors, at long last, were fully open. The ball itself went ahead in complete triumph, a glittering spectacle that permanently fixed the family's social supremacy in the public mind, and cemented Alva's own personal reputation as a woman who took precisely what she wanted and never once apologized for it. She had spent an entire fortune to win a single night. But she understood correctly that this one night had purchased something no ordinary purchase ever could: a permanent, unshakable place at the very pinnacle of society. It was, in its own strange way, a genuinely brilliant investment, though one of a rather unusual and intangible kind. And yet there was an emptiness sitting quietly at the very heart of that victory, an emptiness that would only become clearer with the passing of time. Alva had conquered society completely, but society, it turned out, was a kingdom built almost entirely out of appearances, and appearances, however carefully constructed, could never actually fill an empty marriage or an empty heart. Having won her great social prize, she would soon reach out for another one entirely, and this time the true cost would be measured not in dollars spent, but in the quiet happiness of her own child. First, though, she wanted a monument of her own, a house even grander than the one that had already hosted her great triumph. Not content with having conquered society outright, Alva demanded a monument to match her own personal triumph. William Kissam built her marble house, out in Newport, a dazzling white palace directly inspired by the great classical buildings of Europe, constructed using enormous quantities of imported white marble, at a total cost that would have seemed almost unthinkable even by the extravagant standards of the ultra-rich. It was formally presented to her as a birthday gift. But Marble House was also, in its own quiet way, something closer to a gilded cage, a physical symbol of a marriage that was already, behind its shining marble surface, quietly crumbling apart. The house was extraordinary, even measured against the wildly extravagant standards of the entire era. Vast quantities of imported white marble were shipped in for its construction, gleaming stone that gave the finished palace an almost temple-like sense of purity, set dramatically against the deep blue of the Atlantic behind it. Inside, the rooms were finished with a richness that genuinely defies easy description. There was a gold ballroom absolutely dripping with ornamentation, a dining room built entirely from rose-colored marble, a private library, and even a Gothic room specifically designed to house a curated collection of medieval treasures. The single finest craftsmen available anywhere were employed for the project. The costliest materials money could buy were gathered from across the world. The entire enterprise consumed a sum of money so large it genuinely strains belief, all of it for a private residence used only for a handful of weeks each summer. It was once again, technically a cottage in the peculiar private language of Newport, a house built for only a few weeks of seasonal occupation each year. And like the breakers before it, it represented not the ongoing growth of the family fortune, but rather its steady, deliberate conversion into stone and gold, assets that would generate absolutely no income of their own, while demanding endless, expensive upkeep for as long as the house stood. The great houses of Newport were, in the end, monuments built almost entirely to pure consumption. Marble House stood among the very most spectacular of them all, a shrine, in every real sense, to Alva's own personal will, and to the seemingly bottomless wealth that had funded its construction from start to finish. But the marriage that the house had been built to crown was already quietly failing by the time it was finished. William Kissam, the easygoing yachtsman, and Alva, the fierce and endlessly driven social general, had grown steadily apart from one another over the years, and no amount of surrounding splendor could fully disguise the coldness that had settled permanently between them. Behind the gleaming marble facade, in grand rooms specifically designed for entertaining that now echoed emptily when there was no party underway, Alva found herself confronting the real limits of what her enormous fortune could actually buy. She could compel the whole of society to formally accept her. She could raise an entire marble palace by the sea. She could not, it turned out, compel genuine affection from another human being. And she refused in the end to simply pretend, purely for the sake of appearances, that she was content with what she had. What Alva did next genuinely scandalized the entire country. She divorced her husband, a step that was still almost unheard of among people of their particular social standing at the time, a very public admission of failure that respectable society regarded with real, open horror. Divorce, among the extremely wealthy of this era, carried an enormous social stigma, one that genuinely threatened the very social standing Alva had fought so hard and so long to secure for herself. And yet she went ahead with it anyway, refusing to remain trapped inside an unhappy marriage purely to preserve outward appearances. In doing so, she displayed the exact same iron will that had won her that great social victory years earlier. She had conquered society on her own terms, and now, just as deliberately, she defied its rules on her own terms too. The divorce sent real shockwaves rippling through the entire Gilded Age aristocracy, but Alva weathered the resulting scandal with her characteristic force of will, and would go on in time to remarry and reinvent herself once again. Marble House remained standing, a lasting monument to a marriage that hadn't managed to survive it, its perfect, gleaming room serving as a quiet reminder that even the most beautiful cage in the world is still, in the end, nothing more than a cage. Alva had learned, at enormous personal expense, that money could purchase almost anything in the world except the handful of things that actually mattered most. And yet, even as her own marriage came apart completely, that particular lesson hadn't fully taken root in her. For even while her marriage was ending, Alva was already quietly preparing to arrange another one entirely, this time for her own daughter, and to pursue, through that second marriage, a prize that no amount of American money could otherwise have purchased on its own. While his relatives back in Newport competed endlessly over ever grander cottages, the youngest of the Vanderbilt brothers, George Washington Vanderbilt II, was quietly dreaming on an entirely different scale altogether. Deep in the mountains of North Carolina, near the small town of Asheville, he set about building Biltmore, a sprawling French Renaissance chateau so genuinely immense that it remains, to this very day, the largest privately owned house anywhere in America. It contained hundreds of individual rooms, its own fully working agricultural estate, formal gardens, managed forests and working farms, a private kingdom of sorts, carved directly out of the surrounding Appalachian wilderness. George filled the finished house with treasures from around the world and surrounded himself with beauty at every turn. But maintaining a house of that staggering size devoured money at a genuinely frightening rate, year after year after year, and it stood, in the end, as the ultimate expression of a family that had quietly forgotten how to do anything except spend. George was different from his older brothers in almost every important way. He was quiet, scholarly, deeply bookish, with little real interest in the world of business and a genuine, lasting love for art, literature, and the finer things in life generally. He spoke several languages fluently, read constantly and voraciously, and possessed the sensibility of a dedicated collector and aesthete far more than that of a captain of industry. Where his grandfather had built railroads and his own brothers had built vast social empires, George simply wanted to build something beautiful and lasting, a great house set within a landscape entirely of his own careful design, a genuine retreat from the noise and clatter of the modern industrial world. He chose a vast tract of land in the Blue Ridge Mountains and set about creating, quite literally, his own private domain. He engaged the single most celebrated architect of the entire era, the same man who had already designed several of the grand Vanderbilt palaces elsewhere, along with the most famous landscape designer working anywhere in the country, to help shape the surrounding grounds. Entire forests were deliberately planted and carefully managed as part of the project. The house itself was closely modeled on the grand chateaux of the French Renaissance, rising up with hundreds of individual rooms directly out of the mountain landscape, a genuine European fantasy transported wholesale to the American South. The sheer scale of the place genuinely defies easy description. There were dozens upon dozens of bedrooms, a banquet hall built on cathedral-like proportions, a private library housing many thousands of individual volumes, indoor novelties like a full swimming pool and an indoor bowling alley that were genuinely astonishing for their time, and every single modern convenience the era could possibly provide. The surrounding estate sprawled across an enormous expanse of land, complete with working farms, its own dairy operation, scientifically managed forests, and entire small villages built to house the many people employed just to keep the whole enterprise running smoothly. It was never simply a house. It was, in every real sense, a self-contained world, a private principality answerable to absolutely no one but George himself, and it swallowed money without any real end in sight. Biltmore had been staggeringly expensive simply to build in the first place, but the true financial burden lay in the ongoing cost of keeping it running. An estate of that magnitude required a genuinely vast permanent staff and constant, unending expenditure simply to maintain properly, and it produced almost nothing in the way of income to offset any of that cost. George had poured an enormous share of his own personal inheritance into a creation of real, surpassing beauty that was, in cold financial terms, an essentially bottomless drain on his fortune. The single most magnificent private house in all of America was also, quietly, one of the most financially ruinous, a perfect emblem of a family that could no longer conceive of any better use for its wealth than converting it directly into splendor. In time, the sheer ongoing cost of the place would force George into a series of genuinely painful decisions: the sale of large portions of the surrounding land, an increasingly desperate search for ways to make the vast estate somehow pay for itself. George's original dream had been entirely genuine, and in many real ways deeply admirable, a true work of artistic vision. But it was also, unmistakably, the clearest possible sign of just how far the family had traveled from the hard, practical instincts of its original founder. The Commodore had built things that generated money. His own grandson built the single grandest thing of all, and it did nothing at all except quietly consume it. Biltmore stood as the crown jewel, the ultimate house among all the Vanderbilt houses. But it was only the single most extreme example of a family-wide compulsion that had, by this point, transformed an entire stretch of New York's grandest avenue into a solid row of private palaces, each one standing as a fortune frozen permanently on end. Along Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, the extended Vanderbilt family built out an entire stretch of mansions so consistently grand that the street itself came to be known informally, among ordinary New Yorkers, as Vanderbilt Row. One after another, these limestone and marble chateaux rose up along the avenue, each one grander than the last, filled floor to ceiling with imported tapestries and fine paintings and sweeping staircases fit for European royalty. To walk down that particular avenue during the 1890s was to walk directly past the concentrated wealth of a single American family, put openly on display for the entire world to see and envy. It seemed at the time utterly permanent, eternal, unshakable, built to last forever. And yet, within only a few short decades, nearly every single one of those glittering palaces would be torn down completely and replaced by something else entirely. The stone itself, in the end, would not even manage to outlast the family fortune that had originally paid for it. The great houses of the Fifth Avenue Vanderbilts carried within them, from the very beginning, the seeds of their own eventual destruction, and not only through the sheer ruinous cost of their ongoing upkeep. The city of Manhattan itself was steadily changing all around them. The island was growing rapidly, and the fashionable stretches of Fifth Avenue were becoming, year by year, ever more valuable as prime commercial real estate. The bare land beneath those mansions was worth truly staggering sums to ambitious developers eager to raise office towers and grand department stores in their place. A private family house, however magnificent it might be, simply could not compete economically with the kind of fortune that could be made by selling off the ground it stood on outright. As the family fortune gradually thinned, and the cost of maintaining these enormous palaces became harder and harder to justify, the pressure to finally sell grew steadily more and more irresistible. There is a hard, unmistakable lesson buried somewhere inside the story of Vanderbilt Row, one the family itself was genuinely slow to learn. The houses had originally been built as declarations of pure permanence, monuments specifically meant to announce that the Vanderbilts would rule New York society forever. Instead, in the end, they proved just how fleeting such elaborate displays of wealth could really be, how quickly even the grandest stone palace could fall once the money sustaining it finally ran dry. But the family's very deepest reach for lasting permanence took a different form entirely. Not another house this time, but an actual title of nobility, purchased through the arranged marriage of a daughter who never once wished to be sold off like property. Perhaps no single moment in the entire family saga reveals the strange cruelty running underneath the surface of the Gilded Age quite as clearly as the marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt. Alva, having already conquered New York society and survived her own scandalous divorce, now set her sights firmly on a prize that even her own vast personal fortune could not otherwise directly purchase, a genuine title of ancient European nobility. She arranged for her only daughter, Consuelo, to marry the Duke of Marlborough, a British aristocrat whose family desperately needed fresh American money to save their own crumbling ancestral estate from ruin. There was only one real problem standing in the way. Consuelo was already in love with someone else entirely, and she wanted absolutely nothing to do with the Duke. Her mother's response to this was not persuasion, gentle or otherwise. It was sustained, relentless pressure so total and so absolute that the young woman finally, completely broke under its weight. Consuelo was, by every honest account from people who actually knew her, a genuinely lovely and gentle young woman, tall, graceful, raised in circumstances of almost unimaginable privilege, and yet given remarkably little real say over the direction of her own life. Her mother had determined from very early on that Consuelo would go on to make a truly great match, a marriage specifically designed to carry the Vanderbilt name directly into the oldest, most established ranks of European aristocracy. For Alva, this represented the absolute ultimate ambition of her entire life, a prize standing even higher than the social throne of New York she had already fought so hard to win. American money, formerly married to a genuine British duke, would place the family for the first time among the true nobility of the entire world. But Consuelo, for her part, had already fallen in love with a young American gentleman of her own choosing, and she genuinely hoped to marry him instead, and live a life shaped by her own decisions. When her mother learned of this private attachment, she moved swiftly and ruthlessly to crush it entirely, revealing in the process the full, terrifying force of her own will. Consuelo was deliberately kept apart from the man she actually loved, closely monitored at all times, effectively isolated from outside influence, and subjected to relentless, unyielding pressure to accept the arranged marriage her mother had already put together on her behalf. It became, in every real sense, a prolonged battle of wills between a fiercely determined mother and a daughter who simply lacked any real power to resist her. The Duke, for his own part, had entirely different reasons for pursuing the match, reasons that had very little to do with genuine affection of any kind. His inherited noble title came bundled together with a truly magnificent, but also enormously expensive, ancestral estate, a great historic house that his own family could no longer realistically afford to properly maintain. Like a number of similarly impoverished European aristocrats during this exact era, he looked across the Atlantic toward the daughters of wealthy American millionaires, young women whose family fortunes could potentially restore a crumbling estate, in direct exchange for the considerable prestige of an old and respected title. It was, in every practical sense, a straightforward financial transaction carefully dressed up as a romance, and both mothers and the professional matchmakers involved on either side of the Atlantic understood this perfectly well from the very start. The pressure applied to Consuelo throughout this period was genuinely unrelenting, and the surviving accounts of it remain painful to read even now, more than a century later. She was made to understand, in no uncertain terms, that resistance was entirely futile, that her own personal wishes counted for absolutely nothing against her mother's iron determination, and that she would marry the Duke regardless of whether she consented gladly or not. Worn down completely at last, isolated from the man she truly loved, and thoroughly overwhelmed by a mother whose will she had genuinely never once managed to successfully oppose, the young woman finally surrendered. She agreed, in the end, to a marriage she had never wanted in the first place. There is something deeply, quietly telling in this entire episode about exactly what the family's relentless pursuit of grandeur had ultimately done to it. The very same fortune that had begun with a barefoot boy rowing passengers across a cold New York harbor was now, 2 generations later, being used to purchase a European title by deliberately breaking a young daughter's heart. The same iron will that had once built a stunning social triumph out of a single costume ball was now being aimed directly at a young woman who wanted nothing more than the basic freedom to love whomever she chose. Money had become, in this moment, not a tool for building anything at all, but an instrument of pure coercion, capable, it turned out, of bending even a beloved child entirely to a parent's own personal ambition. The wedding itself went ahead in grand, lavish style, a genuine spectacle for the watching public and a true personal triumph for Alva. But the bride wept quietly behind her wedding veil, and the marriage that money alone had arranged would go on to prove, across the ocean in a great, cold English house, to be exactly the joyless bargain that everyone involved, except perhaps Alva herself, had clearly foreseen from the very beginning. Consuelo married the Duke in 1895, weeping openly behind her bridal veil, and sailed away across the Atlantic to England to formally become a duchess. On paper, at least. It was the ultimate triumph imaginable. An American heiress successfully transformed into genuine European nobility, her own family's money exchanged directly for one of the oldest titles in the whole of Britain. In reality, though, it was a joyless arrangement between two people who did not love each other in the slightest, bound together permanently by an ancestral estate that badly needed cash, and a determined mother who badly needed social status. Consuelo went on to live inside vast, cold English halls, publicly admired by the entire world and privately, profoundly unhappy within them. Her story became, in time, the truest possible symbol of exactly what the family fortune had ultimately become, a tool for attempting to buy things that could never genuinely be bought at all, including love, a real sense of belonging, and lasting peace of mind. The underlying bargain had been made completely explicit within the formal marriage settlement itself. An enormous sum, paid out in railroad securities, passed directly to the Duke, along with a generous guaranteed yearly income money that flowed straight into the ongoing maintenance of his magnificent but steadily crumbling ancestral home. The great historic house had stood proudly for centuries, a genuine monument to English history itself, and it was now, quite literally, Vanderbilt gold, earned originally from steamships and railroads a continent away, that kept its ancient roof from finally caving in. The Duke had gotten exactly what he needed. Consuelo had gotten her title. Neither one of them had chosen the other out of anything even remotely resembling real affection. Life inside the great house proved every bit as bleak as the cold arrangement that had originally produced it. The palace itself was enormous, drafty, and steeped in centuries of rigid tradition that left remarkably little room for the personal wishes of a young American woman who had been given no real say whatsoever in her own marriage. Consuelo moved through its endless rooms largely as a stranger, performing all the expected formal duties of a duchess, bearing the airs her position required of her, and enduring a husband with whom she shared essentially no genuine warmth at all. She was, at the very same time, one of the most publicly envied women anywhere in the world, and privately, one of the loneliest. To the watching public, she appeared to be a dazzling success story, the American girl who had become genuine British nobility, endlessly photographed and admired, held up constantly as the absolute pinnacle of what the great American fortunes could ultimately achieve. But all that public admiration only deepened her private isolation further still. She could never confess the real truth of her situation to anyone without shattering the carefully maintained illusion that everyone around her clearly wished to preserve. So she carried the quiet unhappiness privately, largely alone. Behind the composed, gracious public manner that her formal position constantly demanded of her, she remained, in every meaningful sense, a genuine prisoner inside a palace whose bars were built entirely out of expectation and public appearance. In time, she found her own quiet forms of real purpose. She threw herself into charitable work, using her considerable social position to genuinely improve the lives of the poor around her, and to champion causes she personally believed in, discovering, in the process of that service, a sense of meaning that her own marriage had never once managed to provide her. There was real substance underneath it all, a genuine compassion and sharp intelligence that the narrow role of ornamental duchess had never once allowed the wider world to actually see in her. Eventually, the marriage, which had never truly been a marriage in any meaningful sense to begin with, finally came apart completely. Consuelo and the Duke formally separated, and after many years apart, the union was officially and legally dissolved. Later in life, she went on to marry a man she genuinely, deeply loved, and found, at long last, something close to the real happiness that had been so completely denied her as a young girl. She lived a long life, and in her later years wrote a candid memoir that looked back with remarkably clear eyes at both the glittering surface and the true personal cost of the world she had been raised inside. Her story lingers today as one of the most genuinely poignant in the entire family history, a warning quietly written out in a single daughter's tears. The Vanderbilt fortune had, by this point, reached its single most extravagant ambition yet, successfully purchasing entry directly into the ancient nobility of Europe itself. But the true price had been one young woman's basic personal freedom, and the lesson buried in it, had anyone within the family actually been willing to learn from it, was that a fortune spent purely on outward appearances buys nothing at all that genuinely endures over time. Here is the quiet mathematics that ultimately doomed the entire Vanderbilt family. The Commodore had kept his own empire whole by handing it entirely to a single heir. But every generation that followed him divided the fortune among more and more children with each passing decade, splitting what had once been a single great river of money into smaller and smaller separate streams. At the very same time, the family had gradually stopped actively building new wealth and had settled instead into simply spending what already existed. The railroads that had originally generated all of that money were no longer expanding, ambitious young empires. They had become aging, mature businesses operating inside a rapidly changing world. Mansions produced no income of any kind. Yachts earned nothing at all. Fine art hung silently on walls, doing beautiful, expensive nothing, year after year. A fortune that is only ever spent and never actively grown, and endlessly divided among more and more heirs with each generation, really has only one possible final destination. Consider, for a moment, the simple arithmetic playing out quietly across these generations. The Commodore had left almost the entire fortune to one single son, keeping the whole sum concentrated and genuinely mighty. William Henry, considerably more generous by nature, divided his own wealth among 8 separate children. Those 8 children, in turn, went on to have children of their own, and the great, overwhelming sum that had once stood entirely undivided was now split into ever smaller and smaller individual portions, each new heir receiving only a fraction of what had already become a fraction. What had once been a single, overwhelming fortune slowly became several large fortunes, then a wider scattering of merely comfortable ones, and then, in time, individual portions that could genuinely be exhausted entirely within a single lifetime. At the very same time, something even more consequential was quietly happening beneath the surface of all this division. The underlying source of the family's wealth was itself steadily changing in character. The Commodore, and later his son, had actively built and grown the railroads themselves, creating real new value, adding fresh lines, improving daily operations, generating genuinely fresh income year after year through their own direct efforts. But their descendants, for the most part, took no such active hand in any of it. They simply lived off the existing wealth, rather than actually working to expand it, drawing a steady income from businesses they neither personally managed nor truly understood in any real depth. The engine that had originally produced the entire fortune was quietly left to run on its own, unattended, and nobody remaining in the family was doing the hard, unglamorous work of actually feeding it anymore. The wider world, meanwhile, was also changing in ways that made the family's growing passivity increasingly dangerous. The railroads that had been the great marvel and money-making machine of the Commodore's own era gradually matured into something far more ordinary, heavily regulated, no longer dominant, steadily challenged by newer forms of transportation, and increasingly hemmed in by new laws and government oversight. Meanwhile, entirely new great fortunes were being made elsewhere in the American economy. In oil, in steel, and later in whole industries, the Vanderbilts had never had any real part in building. The family had effectively bet everything on a single kind of business, and had then largely stopped tending even that one business properly, all while the ground beneath their feet kept quietly shifting. And through all of this, the family's spending never once slowed down. The great palaces demanded constant, expensive upkeep. The yachts required full-time paid crews. The parties, the household servants, the long seasons spent in Newport and traveling abroad, the entire elaborate machinery required to keep a great fortune constantly on public display. All of it consumed money at a genuinely ferocious, unending rate. Each successive generation inherited noticeably less than the one before it, yet somehow continued spending as though they had inherited considerably more, living up to a standard originally set by ancestors who had commanded far greater underlying resources. The widening gap between actual income and ongoing expenditure grew wider and wider, year after year, largely hidden for a long time simply by the sheer overwhelming size of what still remained in the family coffers. For quite a while, the fortune really was so vast that all of this quiet erosion could go entirely unnoticed. Even genuinely reckless spending, combined with constant division among heirs, couldn't visibly dent a sum that enormous, and the family carried on believing with perfect and unshaken confidence that they would simply always be rich forever without exception. But belief, however sincerely held, does not actually alter arithmetic. A fortune that is continually divided among more and more people, steadily drawn down without ever being properly replenished, and spent considerably faster than it earns any fresh income, is a fortune operating on a fixed mathematical expiration date, however distant and unimaginable that date might have seemed at the time to the people living through it. The Vanderbilts had, without fully realizing it, already entered a slow, steady decline that was, in hindsight, essentially inevitable from the exact moment. The family stopped actively building new wealth and settled instead into simply enjoying what remained. It would take several more decades for that decline to become fully, undeniably obvious to everyone watching, and it would go on to produce, along the way, both real tragedy and occasional dark comedy in roughly equal measure. But the underlying direction of the whole story was already fixed by this point, and by the fourth generation, the unmistakable signs of it began showing plainly, embodied almost perfectly in the person of one charming, doomed young man who spent his entire inheritance as though he were personally daring it to eventually run dry. Among the members of this fourth generation was Reginald Vanderbilt, a young man who embodied the family's ongoing decline with almost theatrical textbook perfection. He inherited a substantial personal fortune, somewhere around $7.5 million, held for him in trust, and proceeded to gamble it, drink it, and spend it away with genuinely astonishing speed. Fine horses, high-stakes card games, extravagant daily living, and a complete, total disinterest in either earning fresh money or preserving what he already had steadily drained his inheritance away, year after year. By the time of his early, premature death, much of his personal share of the once great Vanderbilt fortune had simply evaporated into thin air. He wasn't, in any real sense, a villain. He was something rather more troubling than that. He was living proof that the family had, by this point, successfully raised an entire generation of people who understood absolutely everything there was to know about spending money, and essentially nothing at all about actually keeping it. Reginald came into his own fortune while still a fairly young man, and set about enjoying every last dollar of it with a devotion that genuinely never once wavered throughout his short life. He loved fine horses and the whole surrounding world of horse shows and competitive racing, and he poured money into that particular passion with real, unmistakable enthusiasm, keeping his own stables and personally breeding fine animals. He was a constant, familiar fixture of fashionable society, generous with his money, endlessly sociable, and utterly without any visible impulse to actually work for a living. Why on earth would he bother working? He had been born rich. He was rich right now, and he genuinely could see no plausible reason to imagine he might ever become anything other than rich in the future. Employment, as far as he was concerned, was simply a concept that applied to other people, not to him. His gambling, meanwhile, was both legendary among his circle and thoroughly ruinous to his finances. He wagered truly enormous sums at cards, and lost them again and again with a carelessness that genuinely appalled the people who watched him do it. He drank heavily, entertained constantly and lavishly, and maintained an entire style of living that consumed money faster than even a substantial Vanderbilt trust fund could comfortably sustain over time. There was no real strategy behind any of it, no underlying plan at all, only the steady, cheerful, unhurried dissipation of a fortune, carried out by a man who had never once in his life been asked to seriously consider where any of that money had originally come from, or whether it might someday actually run out entirely. The particular structure of his inheritance offered him some limited protection from total ruin, and it also quietly revealed the wider family's growing anxiety about exactly this kind of self-destructive behavior. A meaningful portion of his personal wealth had been deliberately locked away inside a trust that he couldn't fully access or destroy on his own, a built-in safeguard against the complete financial ruin that his lifestyle otherwise invited at every turn. But the annual income generated by that trust was still substantial, and the portions of his money he could freely reach, he spent without hesitation, and the underlying trust structure could only slow the ongoing financial bleeding, never fully stop it outright. He lived, quite consistently, right at the very edge of his available means, and often noticeably beyond them, always confidently assuming, somehow, that everything would simply work itself out in the end. The heavy drinking, in the end, accomplished what the reckless gambling alone hadn't quite managed to finish. Years of genuinely hard living gradually destroyed his physical health, and he died relatively young, still only in his 40s, his body worn down completely by a lifetime of sustained excess. He left behind a young second wife and a very small infant daughter, along with a significantly diminished personal fortune, and a cautionary example that the wider family would have done well to study far more closely than they actually did. He had, in the end, taken a sum of money that could genuinely have secured multiple future generations of his family, and reduced most of it to essentially nothing across the span of a single pleasant, dissipated lifetime. Reginald himself was never cruel or genuinely malicious in any real sense. In many ways, by most honest accounts, he was a perfectly likable man, warm, generous with what he had, and simply without the faintest idea of how to be anything at all other than a rich man thoroughly enjoying his own riches. And that, in the end, was precisely the quiet tragedy of him personally, and of the wider family he so perfectly represented. The Vanderbilts had, by this point, raised children so thoroughly insulated from any real sense of want that they never once developed even the faintest capacity to actually preserve what they had already been given. Reginald spent his own fortune simply because spending was really the only thing he had ever genuinely learned how to do with money in the first place. His small infant daughter, left behind when he died, became heir to whatever remained of his diminished portion of the family fortune, a little girl carrying a famous surname, along with a modest trust fund, and no living father to raise her. And that particular child, named Gloria, was about to become the unwilling center of one of the most sensational and genuinely painful public spectacles the entire family would ever have to endure. Reginald left behind a young daughter, Gloria Vanderbilt, and her early childhood quickly became the stuff of national newspaper headlines across the entire country. In the early 1930s, a bitter, deeply sensational custody battle erupted openly over the little heiress, pitting her own mother directly against her aunt in a courtroom drama that thoroughly gripped the entire nation for months on end. The newspapers of the day quickly dubbed her the poor little rich girl, a young child worth an actual fortune, and yet caught, essentially helpless, in the middle of grown adults fighting bitterly over both her money and her basic day-to-day care. It was, in every sense, a public spectacle of great wealth turned genuinely sour, of a family that seemingly had everything imaginable, and yet somehow could not manage to give one small, orphaned girl a simple, peaceful home to grow up in. The girl had been very young indeed when her father died, leaving her as heir to a trust that generated a genuinely substantial annual income. That money, in a very real sense, became something close to a curse for her, because it meant she was no longer simply a child to be loved and carefully raised. She had become, instead, an asset to be actively controlled by whichever adult ultimately won custody of her. Whoever secured legal custody of little Gloria would also, as a direct consequence, gain real influence over the substantial income that came bundled together with her. And this simple, rather ugly underlying fact hung heavily over absolutely everything that followed, quietly poisoning what should otherwise have been the perfectly ordinary business of caring properly for one orphan child. On one side of the courtroom stood her mother, a young widow who had originally married Reginald when she herself was still barely more than a girl, and who now, still relatively young herself, lived a fashionable, restless life moving constantly between America and Europe. On the other side stood the child's aunt, a formidable, genuinely capable woman from the older generation of the Vanderbilt family, a serious person with real personal accomplishments of her own, who firmly believed the young girl would be far better raised inside a stable, disciplined household. The two women, along with the wider family factions quietly backing each of them, went to open war over the child, right there in a public courtroom. The resulting trial was both a genuine sensation and, in equal measure, a real public disgrace. Day after day, the country's newspapers filled their pages with detailed testimony about the private lives of everyone involved, dragging deeply intimate personal details straight out into public view for a thoroughly fascinated readership. The mother's personal character and daily habits were repeatedly attacked in open court. Her basic fitness as a parent was openly questioned. Her entire way of life was held up for public judgment, day after day. Household servants were called to testify. Accusations flew back and forth from both sides. The whole painful business played out in the full, unforgiving glare of national publicity, with one small girl sitting quietly at the very center of it all, her future and her considerable fortune debated at length by total strangers, almost as though she were simply a piece of disputed property rather than a living child. For the child herself, still very young, the entire experience was bewildering and frankly frightening. She found herself pulled constantly between the various adults, each claiming her, made to understand, in ways she was far too young to properly process, that she was really the prize at the center of a struggle she couldn't begin to comprehend. Her own affections and future openly fought over in courtroom language she was simply too young to follow. The newspapers, for their part, gave her that cruel, sticky nickname that would end up following her for the rest of her life. The poor little rich girl, capturing, in just 4 short words, the strange, hollow emptiness of a childhood surrounded by enormous wealth and stripped almost entirely of genuine peace. In the end, the court awarded primary custody to the aunt, ultimately judging that the child would be better served growing up in her particular care, though the mother did retain some limited rights of ongoing visitation. The legal battle itself was, in that narrow sense, formally resolved. But the deeper wounds it left behind didn't heal nearly so easily or so quickly. The girl grew up permanently shaped by that early ordeal, by the lasting sense of having been openly fought over, and of never quite fully belonging anywhere, of being valued as much for what she publicly represented as for who she actually was as a person underneath it all. It was a story that revealed, once again, the peculiar sicknesses that truly great wealth could so easily breed within a family. A family capable of building sweeping marble palaces and purchasing ancient European titles somehow could not manage to give one single orphaned child a simple, loving, ordinary home to grow up in. The very fortune that was supposed to protect her had instead, through no real fault of her own, made her into a public target. And yet, remarkably, this same child, the poor little rich girl of the newspaper tabloids, would go on to grow into a woman of genuine, surprising strength and real creative talent, one who would eventually manage to reclaim her own life story in a way that none of the adults who'd once fought so bitterly over her could possibly have predicted. But that particular chapter still lay ahead of her. First, the old world of Vanderbilt grandeur had to finish its long, slow collapse, and there were still a few family members determined to keep the whole thing standing, right up until the very end. Even as the family's overall fortune continued steadily dwindling, a handful of Vanderbilts still clung fiercely to the old vanished world of pure grandeur. Grace Wilson Vanderbilt, who had married directly into the family, became genuinely famous in her own right as one of the very last great society hostesses, throwing enormous, lavish parties and maintaining a lifestyle of real, extraordinary opulence for decades after it made any real financial sense to do so. She entertained visiting royalty and sitting presidents alike, kept household staff by the dozen, and simply refused to let the entire glittering age quietly die around her. But behind the scenes, the ongoing cost of it all was steadily hollowing out whatever remained of her own particular branch's wealth. She was, in a real sense, the perfect final act of Gilded Age excess, dancing gracefully across a ballroom floor while the floor itself was slowly giving way beneath her feet. Her marriage into the family had itself been something of a scandal from the very start. She had married a Vanderbilt son directly against the fierce disapproval of his own parents, who considered the entire match thoroughly unsuitable, and who never fully reconciled themselves to it for the rest of their lives. That disapproval carried real, lasting financial consequences, because the young man's eventual inheritance was noticeably reduced as a direct result, leaving the young couple with considerably less money than they might otherwise have reasonably expected to receive. They were still, by any ordinary standard, immensely rich. But they began their married life together with a fortune already meaningfully diminished by the wider family's open displeasure. And Grace proceeded, from that point forward, to spend it as though it were entirely limitless. She had a genuine natural gift for entertaining, and an appetite for social grandeur that simply never dimmed across the many decades of her long life. Her home became a recognized center of fashionable society, and she presided over it like an uncrowned queen, hosting lavish gatherings that drew the most celebrated guests of the entire era, including visiting European royalty, whose company she particularly prized above almost everything else. She maintained the full, elaborate apparatus of a truly great household, servants, private carriages, and later motorcars, an endless rotation of social seasons and formal ceremonies, the entire complicated machinery of a way of life that was, even as she continued practicing it faithfully, quietly passing into history all around her. The trouble, of course, was that the wider world she was performing for had already begun to disappear, and the money required to fund the ongoing performance was steadily running out beneath her. The great age of the professional society hostess had really belonged to an earlier era entirely, to the true height of the Gilded Age, and the decades that followed brought war, social upheaval, and profound cultural change that made displays of this kind seem increasingly like curious relics from another time. Grace carried on regardless, almost as though sheer force of will alone could hold back the passage of time itself, keeping up all the old appearances long after the fortune that had once made them effortless had already begun seriously failing underneath her. Her husband, considerably more aware of the underlying arithmetic than she seemed willing to be, grew genuinely troubled by her relentless spending, and the widening gap in their respective attitudes placed real, lasting strain on their marriage. He could see clearly what she seemed either unable or simply unwilling to acknowledge, that the money had real limits after all, and that her particular manner of living was steadily, silently exhausting it. But Grace would not change, and perhaps genuinely could not change. To economize, to entertain on a smaller scale, to live as anything other than a great society lady, would have meant openly admitting that the entire world she had built her personal identity upon was finally ending, and that was an admission she simply refused to make, for as long as she possibly could. She continued in her accustomed style right into old age, maintaining her grand home and her grand manner even as the underlying resources behind both of them shrank alarmingly, year after year. She was, by the end, very much a figure from another vanished time entirely, a living monument to an age that had already passed her by, keeping its old rituals alive through nothing more than sheer stubborn determination. There was something genuinely admirable in that persistence, and something quietly poignant about it too, and something faintly absurd all at once. When she finally died, she left behind the lasting memory of the last truly great society hostess of the old Vanderbilt world, and a branch of the family whose wealth had been seriously, permanently depleted by her long refusal to ever acknowledge that the party was well and truly over. The grand houses she had once filled with guests were, by that point, already beginning to fall, quite literally, to the wrecking crews steadily reshaping the city of New York around them. The palaces of Vanderbilt Row were coming down, one after another, in a slow but unstoppable procession. The magnificent Fifth Avenue mansions, those once unmistakable symbols of unassailable family wealth, had simply become too expensive to properly maintain, and far too valuable as raw real estate to keep standing much longer. They were demolished one by one, their fine interior treasures scattered to auction houses and private collectors, their marble hauled away piece by piece, replaced steadily by office towers and grand department stores. Even the very grandest of the family's private palaces couldn't ultimately survive the combined pressure of a changing city and a steadily shrinking family fortune. To walk down Fifth Avenue today is to walk past nothing but ghosts, over ground where genuine palaces once stood, with almost nothing left standing to mark where they had been. The demolitions arrived steadily across the early decades of the 20th century, gathering real pace as the years passed by. The great French chateau that Alva had originally built to launch her famous social conquest, the very same house that had hosted her legendary costume ball, came down after only a few short decades of existence, its ornate turrets and hand-carved stonework reduced to rubble to make way for new commercial development. It had been, in its day, one of the most celebrated private residences anywhere in America, and it vanished completely within the lifetime of people who had once danced inside its ballroom. The underlying logic behind each individual demolition was brutally simple and unforgiving. The houses themselves were ruinously expensive to maintain, requiring vast permanent staffs and enormous ongoing sums of money simply to keep operating properly, and the family, generation by generation, increasingly lacked either the remaining money or the collective will to keep sustaining them. At the very same time, the land sitting directly beneath these grand houses had become extraordinarily valuable as the city's commercial center steadily expanded northward along the length of Fifth Avenue. A developer would happily pay an absolute fortune for the bare ground alone, far more than the house itself, was genuinely worth to a family that could barely afford to keep running it anymore. The underlying math was simply inescapable, and one by one, the great palaces fell. There was something deeply symbolic in watching these monuments come down. They had originally been built specifically to proclaim permanence, to announce loudly to the entire world that the Vanderbilts had arrived at the summit of American life and intended to reign there forever. Their sheer scale and magnificence had been the entire point from the very beginning, a declaration carved directly in stone that this particular family stood permanently at the top of American society. And now, decades later, they were being systematically broken apart by demolition crews, their grand interiors stripped bare and sold off piece by piece, their empty lots cleared to make way for buildings that could actually generate the kind of steady income the old mansions never once had. The material treasures inside them were scattered to the winds. Imported wood paneling was pried carefully from the walls and sold to collectors. Fireplaces, staircases, and architectural fragments were carted off in pieces, some eventually finding their way into museums or being incorporated into other buildings, but most simply lost entirely to time. Great collections of fine art and furniture were auctioned off publicly, piece by piece. The material splendor that had once taken enormous fortunes to carefully assemble was now scattered across the entire world, and the houses that had originally held it all together simply ceased to exist. It was almost as though the physical, visible evidence of the family's former supremacy was being methodically erased from the very city it had once so completely dominated. The single greatest of the connected Fifth Avenue palaces, the enormous structure that had once housed the family's leading figures, held out somewhat longer than most of the others, but eventually met precisely the same fate, torn down in the years immediately following the Second World War. With its final destruction, the last of the truly great Fifth Avenue Vanderbilt mansions passed permanently into memory. The whole corridor of palaces that had once been counted among the genuine sights of the city was now gone, almost entirely without a trace, replaced by the perfectly ordinary commercial buildings of a thoroughly modern metropolis. Today, a person can walk the entire length of that famous avenue and find essentially nothing to suggest that a single family had once lined it with private chateaus. But not everyone within the family watched this long, slow disappearance in complete silence. One Vanderbilt from the younger generation looked hard at the fall of his own family's world and made the deliberate decision to write about it honestly, to tell the plain truth about the decline, even at the real cost of scandalizing his own relations in the process. Not every single Vanderbilt was blind to what was actually happening around them. Cornelius Vanderbilt IV, a descendant of the family who became a working journalist and published writer, looked at his own extended family with a genuinely critical, unsparing eye, and tried honestly to warn both the wider world and his own relatives about the underlying emptiness sitting at the very heart of their once legendary wealth. He wrote openly about the family's long decline, its various obsessions, and its endless follies, in a manner that genuinely scandalized some of his own relatives while quietly enlightening nearly everyone else who read it. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else who still carried the family name, that the fortune had never actually been stolen from them, nor lost to any single sudden disaster. It had simply been frittered away, slowly and elegantly, by people who had never once learned what money was actually supposed to be for. He was, in his own particular way, a genuine rebel against nearly everything his own family had come to represent. Rather than quietly settling into the comfortable idleness that had already consumed so many of his relations before him, he chose deliberately to work, pursuing an active career in journalism and publishing, determined to make his own independent way in the world and earn his own reputation within the competitive world of American newspapers. It was an unusual choice for a Vanderbilt to make, and not an entirely successful one purely in business terms, since several of his own publishing ventures ultimately struggled or failed outright. But it reflected a genuine spirit that most of the wider family had by this point, long since lost, a real willingness to labor honestly, rather than simply to spend freely. His most lasting contribution to the family's history came through the books he eventually wrote about his own relatives. With a candor that genuinely horrified several of them, he carefully chronicled the family's extravagances, its follies, and the slow, steady dissipation of the once great fortune, offering a kind of honest farewell to the vanished world of Fifth Avenue and the gilded excess that had once defined it so completely. He didn't spare his own family's collective pride in the process. He described the reckless spending in plain terms, the hollow public display, the way that generation after generation had simply consumed what it had been handed without ever once contributing anything genuinely new of its own. This struck several Vanderbilts as something close to a betrayal, a public airing of family secrets that, in their view, ought to have remained safely private. The very idea of a family member writing frankly and publicly about the family's own decline, exposing its accumulated weaknesses for the wider world to read, struck many of his relatives as a genuinely unforgivable breach of family loyalty. But there was real courage buried in what he did, along with genuine honesty, and a sincere desire to draw a meaningful lesson from the surrounding wreckage. He had watched, up close and personally, exactly what unchecked inherited wealth had done to his own family, and he simply refused to pretend, for anyone's comfort, that it hadn't happened at all. His writing captured something that the demolished palaces and the exhausted trust funds had already proven true beyond any real argument. The Vanderbilt fortune had not been destroyed by any outside force acting against the family. No war had ever seized it from them. No market crash had wiped it out in a single sudden blow. No villain had crept in and stolen it away in the night. It had simply been spent, elegantly and relentlessly, generation after generation, by people who had genuinely never learned that money must be actively tended, just as much as it is meant to be enjoyed. The long decline had been entirely self-inflicted, the perfectly natural result of a family that had gradually forgotten how to do anything at all except consume. There is a particular kind of value in a warning that comes honestly from within a family, from someone who has genuinely seen the whole thing up close and has every possible reason in the world to simply conceal it instead. Cornelius IV had no real need to expose his own family's failings publicly. He could easily have kept a comfortable, profitable silence and simply traded quietly on the famous family name, exactly as so many others before him had done. Instead, he chose openly to tell the truth, holding up his own family as a genuine, cautionary lesson about the real dangers of inherited wealth pursued without any real purpose or lasting discipline behind it. His was, in the end, a fairly lonely voice among the Vanderbilts, and not always a welcome one. But it pointed clearly toward a deeper truth that the entire sweep of the family's history had already illustrated beyond doubt, that a fortune is never simply a birthright to be passively enjoyed, but a genuine ongoing responsibility, and that wealth, held without any real will to preserve or actively renew it, is really nothing more than a slower, more elegant kind of poverty. And even as the old world of Vanderbilt grandeur finally finished collapsing, and the once great family fortune finished quietly draining away entirely, one particular member of the family was, at almost exactly the same time, quietly proving the other half of that same hard truth, that the family name could still genuinely mean something, if only someone within it were finally willing to build again from scratch. The poor little rich girl from that painful, headline-grabbing custody battle grew up into a genuinely remarkable woman who managed to do something almost no other Vanderbilt across the previous several generations had ever quite managed. She built her own personal success, entirely from the ground up. Gloria Vanderbilt became, over the course of her long life, a working artist, an actress, a published writer, and eventually an enormously successful fashion designer, putting her own famous family name directly onto a line of clothing that went on to sell in the millions of units worldwide. In doing so, she managed to earn a genuine fortune with her own two hands, rather than simply spending down one she had merely inherited from someone else. It was a striking, almost poetic reversal of the wider family pattern, a Vanderbilt actively creating new wealth, instead of simply consuming what remained of the old, reaching all the way back across the decades to touch something of the same restless spirit the original Commodore himself might have grudgingly respected, had he lived to see it. Her early life had given her every reasonable excuse in the world to simply become one more quiet casualty of the wider family pattern, a wounded heiress drifting aimlessly through a life of hollow privilege and private unhappiness. The custody battle of her childhood had marked her deeply and permanently, and her path through adulthood was often genuinely turbulent, marked by difficult personal relationships and real sorrow along the way. She could easily have retreated entirely into the narrow role the wider world seemed to have already assigned her, the tragic rich girl, living out her days quietly on the fatting remnants of a once famous family fortune. Instead, she chose, again and again throughout her long life, to actively create something new. She was genuinely talented in her own right, and genuinely driven in ways that had grown noticeably rare within her particular branch of the family by this point. She painted seriously and exhibited her own original work publicly. She acted professionally, both on the stage and later on television. She wrote several books across her lifetime, both honest memoirs and original fiction, exploring her own extraordinary life story with unusual candor and self-awareness. She designed, decorated, and steadily turned her genuine natural eye for beauty into an entire series of creative business ventures. Where her ancestors had poured their considerable energy almost entirely into public display, she poured hers, instead, directly into real work, and the underlying difference showed clearly in the results she achieved. Her single greatest commercial triumph came within the world of fashion, when she lent both her famous name and her genuine personal taste to a line of clothing that quickly became a nationwide sensation. The garments carrying her name sold in truly enormous quantities, making her genuinely wealthy in her own right, far beyond the increasingly faded circles of old New York society, and reaching an entirely new American audience who had never even heard of Newport or Vanderbilt Row. It was a thoroughly modern kind of success, built carefully on branding, personal style, and sustained hard work, and it made her authentically, independently wealthy through her own direct efforts, rather than through any accident of birth. There was a real, quiet, poetic justice buried in all of it, and a kind of gentle vindication too. The very same child who had once been fought over in open court, as though she were simply an asset, valued primarily for the trust fund legally attached to her name, grew up into a woman who created her own independent value entirely from scratch, and firmly refused to be defined purely by the wreckage of what she'd been handed as a small child. She took the famous family name, which by that point carried nearly as much quiet sorrow attached to it as it did glamour, and made it mean something genuinely new, attaching it firmly to her own personal achievements, rather than to the increasingly distant, vanished glories of her long-departed ancestors. She lived a long, genuinely creative life, reinventing herself many times over across the decades, weathering real personal tragedies along the way with real resilience, and remaining a figure of genuine, substantial accomplishment right into her later years. She understood, in a way that so many of her own relatives simply never had, that a family name is really only ever as valuable as what a person actually chooses to do with it, and that true, lasting security lies not in what one happens to be given at birth, but in what one actually chooses to build for themselves over a lifetime. She had learned that particular lesson the hard way. As a frightened, bewildered child sitting in a courtroom, and she carried it with her, faithfully, for the rest of her long life. When she finally died in advanced old age, She left behind not the scattered ruins of a squandered inheritance, but the genuine fruits of an entire lifetime of real, sustained work, and a son who would go on to carry both the famous family name and her own hard-won personal values forward into the future. She had proven, quite conclusively, that the Vanderbilt story didn't actually have to end in pure dissipation and decline, that even the most burdened heir imaginable could still choose, deliberately, to create something new, rather than simply spend down whatever remained of the old. But the larger, unforgiving arithmetic of the wider family fortune had already reached its final, inevitable conclusion by this point, and it had done so in one single, remarkable, almost cinematic moment, when the scattered descendants of the once richest man in America finally gathered together in one place and discovered, collectively, exactly what actually remained. In 1973, more than 120 members of the extended Vanderbilt family gathered together for a large family reunion at Vanderbilt University, the very same college the old Commodore himself had once endowed, generations earlier, with a portion of his enormous fortune. And there, in one single, quiet, almost unbelievable fact, the entire sweeping arc of the whole family story finally revealed itself completely. Among all of those many descendants of the richest man ever to have lived in America up to that point, there was reportedly not one single millionaire left standing anywhere among them. The fortune that had once dwarfed the entire national treasury of the United States, that had built sprawling marble palaces and purchased ancient European titles and dazzled the watching world for the better part of a century, had scattered completely into nothing, all within considerably less than 100 years. The setting for this final reckoning couldn't possibly have been more fitting. The university itself was, in fact, one of the very few genuinely lasting gifts the old Commodore had ever made during his lifetime, an endowment he'd established quite late in his life, a rare instance of the family's great fortune actually being turned toward something lasting and useful, rather than simply spent purely on private display. That his own scattered descendants should end up gathering there, on ground that still carried his name, specifically to confront just how completely his once mighty fortune had vanished, gave the entire occasion a real weight and irony that nobody present that day could possibly have missed. The underlying fact of it is genuinely worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Less than 100 years earlier, a single Vanderbilt had died holding a personal fortune so enormous that it reportedly exceeded the total amount of money then held in the entire United States Treasury. His son had very nearly doubled that already staggering sum. Their combined wealth, at its absolute peak, had stood among the very greatest fortunes ever privately assembled by any single family in the entire recorded history of the world. And now, well within the span of years separating a grandfather from his own great-grandchildren, that colossal sum had been so thoroughly divided, spent, gambled away, and otherwise dissipated that not one single descendant gathered in that particular room that day could genuinely claim even $1 million to their own name. It hadn't happened through any single dramatic catastrophe at all. There had been no sudden market crash to blame, no outright fraud, no government confiscation that anyone could reasonably point a finger at. The fortune had simply been consumed, steadily, and rather elegantly, across each successive generation, by a family that consistently spent without ever properly earning, and divided without ever properly replenishing what it had already given away. Each successive generation had received noticeably less than the one before it, and had nonetheless gone right on spending just as freely as their wealthier ancestors once had. Each generation had built or carefully maintained things that produced absolutely no meaningful income of their own. Each generation had simply assumed, without ever seriously questioning it, that the money would always somehow still be there. And then, quite suddenly, one day, it simply wasn't there anymore. That 1973 reunion still stands today as one of the single most striking illustrations anywhere in American history of a simple, easily forgotten truth. Great wealth does not, on its own, perpetuate itself indefinitely. It is not some kind of permanent, fixed condition, but rather a living, breathing thing that must be actively preserved and continually renewed by every generation that holds it. And a family that quietly forgets this basic truth will inevitably lose everything, no matter how enormous the original starting sum might once have been. The Vanderbilts had begun with more raw wealth than almost anyone else in recorded human history, and had somehow managed, through nothing more sinister or dramatic than sustained extravagance and quiet neglect, to arrive at genuinely ordinary financial means within the span of just a few short generations. There is, notably, no real villain anywhere in this particular ending, and that absence is really part of what makes the whole story so quietly haunting to sit with. The people who ultimately spent the great fortune away weren't wicked people by any honest measure. Many of them were, by all accounts, genuinely charming, culturally sophisticated, generous, even admirable in various individual ways. They simply never learned the underlying discipline that had originally built the wealth in the first place, having been so completely and thoroughly shielded from any real sense of want that the very idea of a genuine financial limit had come to seem almost entirely unreal to them. They spent because spending was really the only thing any of them had ever properly learned to do with money, and the fortune, vast as it originally was, simply could not survive the sustained assault of their own innocent, endless, generation after generation consumption. By the time those 120 scattered descendants finally gathered together beneath the Commodore's own name that day in 1973, the great family fortune had already become a matter of historical record rather than any kind of present financial reality. The Vanderbilts remained, and still remain today, a genuinely famous American family. But they were, by that point, no longer in any meaningful sense a rich one. The money that had once defined them so completely, for the better part of a full century, was simply gone. And yet, remarkably, the story doesn't actually end there in total emptiness. For what the family ultimately lost in raw gold, it had, in scattered and often unexpected ways, at least partly redeemed through other things that would go on to prove considerably more lasting than any single fortune ever could. And so we finally arrive at what genuinely endures long after the ending. The money itself is gone now, largely scattered to the winds, but the physical traces of the Vanderbilt still remain scattered quietly across America, like footprints left behind by a slowly receding tide. Biltmore still stands today, up in its own mountains, now fully open to the public. The Breakers still welcomes travelers from around the world, who wander its marble halls in genuine, quiet wonder. Grand Central still moves millions of ordinary people every single day, beneath the same vaulted ceiling the family originally raised over a century ago. The university still teaches generation after generation of new students, faithfully carrying the old Commodore's name forward into futures he himself could never possibly have imagined. The great palaces of Fifth Avenue are entirely gone now, reduced to memory, but not everything the family ever built has vanished completely, and some small portion of what actually survives has, in the end, genuinely outlived the underlying fortune many, many times over. There is a real, quiet lesson buried in exactly what lasted, and what ultimately did not. The things the family built purely for public display, the mansions specifically meant to announce their own supremacy to the watching world, proved, in the end, to be the single most fragile things of all, torn down within only a few short decades of first being raised. But the things that served some genuine purpose beyond the family's own private vanity endured, quietly, long after everything else had crumbled away. The great train station still functions today as an actual working station, useful and genuinely alive, woven permanently into the daily rhythm of a great city's life. The university still educates new students every single year. Even the grand surviving houses have found real new life as places the general public can now freely enter and enjoy, transformed gradually from private monuments to individual vanity into shared, lasting inheritances belonging to everyone. What was originally built to genuinely serve some larger purpose ultimately outlasted what had only ever been built purely to impress. The family itself never actually vanished entirely, even though its once legendary wealth eventually did. The Vanderbilt name lived on, carried faithfully forward by descendants who had to make their own way in the wider world much as perfectly ordinary people do, without the comfortable cushion of some inexhaustible family fortune behind them. Some of them struggled genuinely with that new reality. Others embraced it fully. And a few of them, like the remarkable woman who had once been known simply as the poor little rich girl, went on to build entire lives of real, substantial accomplishment, entirely on their own individual terms. In the modern age, the family's most widely recognized living descendant became a professional journalist, the son of Gloria Vanderbilt, a man who reports the daily news to millions of viewers and who has spoken quite openly, on several occasions, about being deliberately raised to make his own independent way in the world. He has said plainly, more than once, that he never actually expected to inherit any great fortune at all, that he was carefully taught the genuine value of hard work and real self-reliance, rather than being raised with any lingering expectation of endless inherited money. In him, and in his remarkable mother before him, something of the old Commodore's original restless spirit does seem to have quietly returned at last. Not the ruthlessness of the original founder, certainly, but the deeper underlying understanding that a person really must build their own life for themselves, rather than simply coast indefinitely on the past achievements of the dead. There is a strange, quiet kind of peace in how this whole long story ultimately resolves itself. The Vanderbilts, in the end, proved conclusively that great wealth is never really a resting place at all, but rather something closer to a river, always moving, genuinely impossible to hold onto forever, forever slipping quietly through the fingers of anyone who tries to grasp it too tightly, for too long. The fortune that once seemed as permanently fixed as the marble it was so lavishly carved into flowed away almost entirely within less than a single century, while the things done with genuine purpose, the station, the school, the beauty carefully preserved for the enjoyment of others, simply remained standing. Money, as it turns out in the end, is really the single least durable thing that any great family can ever hope to leave behind for those who come after them. The barefoot boy who once rowed passengers across a cold, windswept New York harbor went on to build the single largest personal fortune his entire country had ever seen up to that point in its history. And his own descendants, across the generations that followed, somehow managed to lose almost every last bit of it. It would be easy enough to read that simply as a story of pure failure, and in one narrow sense, it genuinely is exactly that. But it's also, at the very same time, a quieter story about the real limits of money itself, about what it can actually buy, and what it fundamentally cannot, about how even the coldest, most permanent-seeming marble eventually grows cold to the touch, and the grandest parties eventually end, and the gold eventually runs out completely, while other, far quieter things somehow manage to endure. The Vanderbilts had, for one brief glittering moment in American history, genuinely had everything imaginable. And then, quite simply, they did not anymore. And in the strange, almost poetic arithmetic of it all, there is something genuinely worth carrying with you now, out into the growing dark. The truest riches a person can ever hold are rarely, if ever, the kind that can actually be spent. So here we finally are, at the very end of a very long, very golden road together. Tonight we followed a single American family, all the way from one barefoot boy rowing passengers across a cold harbor, forward through time to a quiet room full of his own scattered descendants, standing together and discovering they couldn't find a single millionaire among any of them. Along the way, there were steamships and sprawling railroads, marble palaces and glittering ballrooms. There was a daughter effectively sold for a European title, and a small girl fought over in open court like a piece of disputed treasure. There was ambition so fierce it built an entire empire from nothing, and spending so careless and unthinking it eventually dissolved that same empire completely away. Laid out end to end like this. It stands as one of the most extraordinary rise and fall stories that American history has ever quietly offered up. And yet, for all their staggering fortune, the Vanderbilts were, underneath everything, only ever people. They wanted, at bottom, roughly the same things the rest of us want out of life: to be genuinely admired, to truly belong somewhere, to leave something lasting behind that would outlive them. They simply happened to have more money than almost anyone else alive with which to go chasing after those same simple things. And money, as it turns out in the end, is really a rather poor tool for catching hold of the things that actually matter most in a human life. It could raise a marble palace, but it couldn't fill an empty marriage. It could purchase an ancient title, but it couldn't buy a daughter's genuine happiness. It could dazzle the entire watching world, and still slip quietly away, like water running through open, outstretched hands. So tonight, as you lie there warm and still in the growing quiet dark, there is a gentle, simple comfort worth carrying with you into sleep. You don't need any great fortune at all to hold on to the things that truly last in this life. The Commodore's gold is long gone now, scattered to the wind. But the station he built still hums quietly with life every single day, and the beauty his family left scattered behind them still, even now, welcomes total strangers home. Let the striving settle now. Let the numbers slowly fade and drift away. And let yourself drift off now, too, into a rest that no amount of money in the world could ever quite buy for you.